Welcome back, my family. Before we dive into tonight's creepy little journey, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who loves a good scare before bed. I would love to know where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. So drop it down in the comments and hype me up a little on YouTube. Now, get comfortable, dim the lights, and let us step into tonight's story. I survived the overnight shift, but something stayed behind and kept working after I quit. I used to think overnight shifts were peaceful. That's the word I always used when people ask why I worked nights peaceful. No customers arguing, no managers hovering, no rush. Just long stretches of quiet broken up by small, familiar sounds. The low hum of the air conditioner above the aisles, the refrigerator compressors clicking on and off in the back, the soft buzz of the neon sign outside bleeding through the front windows. It was the kind of quiet that let your shoulders drop without you even realizing they were tense. Most nights, it was just me and the cameras. I'd wipe down the counter, straighten the shelves that never really needed it, pour myself another cup of burnt coffee from the pot that had been sitting there since midnight. The security monitors glowed in the corner. 4 grainy angles of the store, the parking lot, the stock room. I checked them out of habit more than fear. Nothing ever happened. No movement, no alerts. Just empty aisles and my own reflection when I passed too close to the screen. That's why it took me a while to notice when something felt off. It started small. A sound I couldn't place. Not loud, just wrong. A faint scuff, like a shoe brushing concrete somewhere behind the shelves. I froze listening, holding my breath without meaning to. The store settled back into its rhythm. The fridge clicked. The vents sighed. I told myself it was nothing. Old buildings make noise. Night shifts mess with your head. I went back to work. A few minutes later, the intercom beeped. Just once. That sharp electronic chirp that meant someone had pressed the button in the back hallway. The sound echoed through the store, too loud in the quiet. I stared toward the stockroom door, my stomach tightening. Nobody was back there. I knew that. The door was locked. I had locked it myself at the start of the shift. I checked the cameras. All clear. No movement. No shapes. No shadows. Just the same empty frames I'd seen 1,000 times before. I laughed under my breath, embarrassed at how fast my heart was pounding. I told myself I needed sleep. I told myself I was alone. Then the intercom crackled again. This time, a voice came through. Calm. Close. Familiar in the way voices only sound when they're meant for you. You can finish your shift, it said. I'll lock up. The words hung in the air long after the speaker went dead. The hum of the air conditioner felt louder. The refrigerator clicked again twice. Somewhere behind me, I heard a slow, deliberate footstep. I didn't turn around. Because in that moment, the worst part wasn't the fear. It was the certainty that whatever was still there had been there all along, and that it kept working long after I quit. I used to tell people the overnight shift was the easiest money I'd ever made, not because it paid well, it didn't, but because nothing ever happened. That's what I believed. I believed the night shift was a pocket of time the rest of the world forgot about. The kind of quiet you can lean into. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only awake person in your zip code. The store sat on the edge of a suburb that thought of itself as nice. Not rich, not gated, just tidy. Lawns trimmed. Porch lights on timers. A stretch of road that connected 2 bigger routes. And then right in the middle of that stretch, our 24/7 convenience store, like a lonely fish tank lit up in the dark. If you drove past it at 2 in the morning, you'd see the same thing. Every time, fluorescent lights so bright they made the night look fake. The neon sign buzzing above the windows, and a parking lot that looked freshly abandoned. The faded white lines on the asphalt, a couple of oil stains that never went away, the trash can near the ice machine that always overflowed with crumpled lottery tickets and styrofoam cups. Most nights, there wasn't even a car out there. The road in front of the store went quiet in a specific way. After midnight, like the traffic didn't just slow down, it disappeared. Every now and then, a pair of headlights would slide across the glass and vanish. If you were standing at the register, you could hear those cars before you saw them. The low hiss of tires on asphalt, the faint rattle of something loose in a trunk, the Doppler shift of an engine climbing a gear and leaving you alone again. Then the store would settle back into its own sounds. The familiar ones. The ones I actually liked. The air conditioner was the loudest. It wasn't the soft, clean hum you get in a new building. It sounded tired. It would kick on with a cough and a shudder, like it had to convince itself to work, and then it would drone steadily from the ceiling vents, cold breath spilling down the aisles in invisible sheets. If you stood under the vent by the refrigerated drinks, the air would raise goosebumps on your forearms even in summer. Then there was the refrigerator chorus compressors, turning on and off in the back, the glass doors up front, fogging and clearing the occasional click of a fan blade hitting frost. Those noises were so constant, they almost became comforting, like the store was a living thing with a heartbeat and a breathing pattern. When the compressors shut off all at once, the silence would hit like a sudden pressure change, and I'd find myself waiting for the sound to come back, like I couldn't relax until the world started humming again. The coffee smell never left, no matter how many times I cleaned. During the day, it was fresh, sharp, and hopeful. At night, it turned into something older, bitter, burnt. The kind of smell that clings to your clothes and makes your hands feel like you've been touching pennies. Even after I washed up, I'd catch it on my skin like it had soaked in. I didn't mind it. I was 21 broke and stubbornly proud of being able to handle things other people couldn't. I told myself that working nights meant I was tougher than the people who needed sunlight and coworkers and noise. I told myself the quiet was a privilege, like I'd been let into a secret version of the world. The store helped sell that lie. It was clean in the way chain stores are clean. Bright floors, neat shelves, everything in straight lines. A security mirror in the corner that showed you the aisles behind your back. The lottery display blinking softly. A row of scratchers under plastic. A wall of cigarettes behind the counter with little red and white labels so perfectly aligned it looked like someone measured them with a ruler. And in the corner, mounted up high, the cameras. 4 of them. One above the register, one watching the main aisle, one aimed at the stockroom door, and one facing the parking lot through the front windows. Their feed ran to a small monitor near the employee-only door, a square screen divided into 4 grayscale boxes. The video was never crisp. Everything looked like it had been filmed through a thin layer of dust. But it did the job. You could see if someone walked in. You could see if a car pulled up. You could see if you needed to reach for the panic button under the counter. At least that's what I told myself. The truth is, I watched those camera feeds the way you check your front door lock before bed. Not because you expect it to be open, because it might be. Because the act of checking calms something in your brain. It gives you a story you can live inside. I'm safe because I verified I'm safe. Most nights, the cameras showed nothing but my own movements. Me wiping the counter, me leaning down to stock gum, me walking to the back to grab a box of chips. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection in the glass doors of the coolers and flinch for half a second, just enough to remind myself I was alone. Then I'd laugh quietly at myself, like it was a harmless joke. I preferred being alone. The few customers who came in after midnight weren't the same as the daytime crowd. They were quieter. They avoided eye contact. They came in for very specific things: gas cigarettes, a bottle of water, a pack of cheap batteries, and they left without lingering. The doors would chime when they entered, the sound bright and childish against the dead air. And I'd look up and do my customer service voice, like I hadn't been staring at the same empty parking lot for an hour. "Hey, how's it going?" They'd nod, murmur something, pay, and be gone. Then the door would shut. The chime would die, and the store would return to its hum. The AC, the refrigerators, the faint buzz of neon, the gentle flicker of fluorescent lights that you don't notice unless you're exhausted. It felt controlled. It felt safe. Even the back hallway felt safe to me at first, because it didn't feel mysterious. It was just employee stuff. A narrow corridor painted an ugly beige, a mop sink, stacked boxes, the break room, with a plastic table and 2 folding chairs. A bulletin board with old flyers and a schedule sheet that was always curling at the corners. The manager's handwriting on it, thick black marker, crossing out names and rewriting shifts. I learned that board like it mattered. Who worked mornings? Who had weekends off? Who called out? Who hated who? That was another reason I liked nights no drama. No overlap. No whispered conversations that stopped when you walked in. Just me, the bright store, and the long dark outside. I would have kept believing it forever if nothing had changed. But there was one thing, one detail that always floated around the edges of that schedule board, like a smudge you couldn't scrub off. A name. Not mine. Not the manager's. Not any of the people I'd met. Just one name that used to be written in the overnight slot before I started. Sometimes you'd see it faintly if the paper caught the light the right way, like the marker had pressed so hard it scarred the sheet beneath. When I asked about it, the manager didn't look up from counting the register drawer. He just shrugged, like I'd asked about a brand of paper towels. "Oh," he said. "Yeah, that guy." Then after a pause that felt a little too long to be casual, he added, "He just stopped showing up." And that was all he ever said. Routine is a strange thing. You don't notice it forming. One night bleeds into the next until your body starts moving before your brain tells it to. That's what the overnight shift did to me. It carved grooves into my behavior, shallow at first, then deeper, until I could have worked that store blindfolded. Every shift began the same way. I clocked in at 10:58 p.m., never 11:00. I liked seeing the extra 2 minutes on my time card. It made me feel ahead of things. The register drawer slid open with a hollow thunk as I counted the bills, the smell of old paper money mixing with coffee and disinfectant. I tapped the screen on the POS, waiting for it to wake up, listening to the faint beep it made when it accepted my login. That sound became a starting gun. The night had officially begun. I wiped the counter next, always left to right. The cleaner left a sharp, almost sweet chemical smell, that burned the inside of my nose for a second before fading. The laminated surface was cool under my palm, and I pressed harder than I needed to, as if friction alone could scrub away the long hours ahead. The scanner sat silent beside the register, a black plastic eye waiting to read barcodes, its little red light blinking patiently. Beep. I tested it on a candy bar I wasn't going to buy. The sound cut through the air cleanly and predictably. I put the bar back and felt something settle in my chest. Predictability mattered at night. The coffee came next. It always did. I dumped the old pot down the sink in the back, watching the dark liquid swirl and vanish, then refilled the reservoir with water that smelled faintly metallic. The filter crinkled in my fingers. I scooped the grounds without measuring too many shifts to need instructions and slid the pot into place. When I hit the button, the machine responded with a familiar click and a low, warming hum that would last for hours. Steam rose, slowly, carrying that bitter smell that told me time was moving forward, whether I felt it or not. By midnight, everything was where it should be. The shelves faced, the floors dry, the lottery terminal humming quietly to itself. I leaned against the counter sometimes, stretching my lower back, listening to the store breathe. The air conditioner kicked on above me with its tired groan, and the vents rattled just enough to be noticeable. Cold air slid down the back of my neck. I shivered, not because I was cold, but because my body expected it. I checked the cameras out of habit. The monitor showed 4 neat boxes, each stamped with the same message in blocky white letters: no motion detected. The parking lot was empty, just dark asphalt reflecting the store's lights like a shallow pool. The main aisle stood straight and silent. The stockroom door was shut, its metal handle catching a dull highlight. My own image drifted through the frames. When I moved, blurred, slightly delayed, like the cameras were always a half-second behind reality. I liked that delay. It made the world feel buffered, filtered. Every hour had its own rituals. At 12:30, I refilled the napkin dispensers. At 1:00, I checked the bathrooms, even though no one had used them. At 2:00, I mopped the same stretch of floor, near the coolers, watching the fluorescent lights ripple across the wet tiles. At 3:00, I made another pot of coffee, whether it needed it or not. The sounds repeated themselves in loops. Beep the scanner, click the fridge compressor, hum the lights, the AC, the building itself. Those sounds became anchors. If I heard them in the right order, at the right intervals, my mind stayed calm. They told me nothing was wrong. They told me I was in control. Sometimes I caught myself talking out loud, narrating small actions just to break the silence. Nothing dramatic, just fragments. All right, there we go. Almost time. My voice sounded strange in the empty store, like it didn't quite belong to the space. The ceiling was too high, the aisles too long. The words didn't echo exactly, they just disappeared, swallowed by the hum. When customers did come in, they felt like interruptions, more than interactions. I'd hear the door chime a bright, cheerful sound that felt out of place at 2 a.m, and I'd straighten automatically. Smile, nod. The routine took over, carrying me through the exchange without effort. Scan, beep, total, click, receipt. Then they'd leave, and the door would close, and the store would sigh like it was relieved to have me to itself again. I checked the cameras more often than I needed to. Every 10 minutes, sometimes every 5. I didn't think of it as paranoia. I thought of it as responsibility. The screen always rewarded me with the same message: no motion detected. Seeing those words, was like hearing a heartbeat. It reassured me that the system was watching even when I wasn't. That if something did happen, I'd know. That nothing could sneak up on me without being seen first. That belief mattered. Because there were moments, small ones easy to ignore, when the store felt too quiet. When the hum dipped for half a second, or the refrigerator seemed to pause all at once. In those moments, my eyes snapped to the monitor without conscious thought, and I waited for the words to ground me again. No motion detected. Good. Control wasn't about power. It was about familiarity. I knew where every shadow fell at night. I knew which shelf creaked if you leaned on it. I knew the sound the ice machine made when it jammed. I knew that if I stood still long enough, I could hear my own pulse under the ambient noise. That knowledge wrapped around me like armor. It made me confident. It made me careless. Looking back now, I understand something. I didn't then. Routine doesn't just calm you. It blinds you. It teaches your brain what to ignore. It trains you to stop questioning things that repeat themselves. The cameras always said no motion detected, so I stopped really looking. The sounds always followed the same pattern. So when one didn't, I told myself it would. I believed that if I did everything the same way every night, nothing could surprise me. That the store was predictable because I was predictable. That safety was something you could earn through repetition. I didn't know yet that routines don't protect you from what's watching. They just make it easier for something else to learn your schedule. And at that point in my life, standing behind the counter, coffee warming cameras glowing softly in the corner, I still thought control was real. I still thought the night shift was safe. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. That's the part that bothers me the most when I think back on it now. Not that I heard something strange, but that my brain tried so hard to erase it the moment it registered. It was subtle, small, the kind of sound you can explain away without even realizing you're doing it. I was behind the counter, leaning forward slightly, forearms resting on the cool laminate as I scrolled through my phone. The store was in one of its quiet stretches, the kind where time feels stretched thin, like it might snap if you move too fast. The air conditioner was humming steadily above me, the refrigerators clicking on in staggered intervals, never quite syncing up. Somewhere deep in the building, a pipe knocked once, then settled. I remember thinking how normal everything felt. That was when the intercom beeped. Just a single sharp beep, clean and electronic, cutting straight through the low ambient noise like a needle through fabric. It wasn't loud exactly, but it was precise, intentional. The sound the system made when someone pressed the button in the back hallway to make an announcement. I froze. Not dramatically. Not in a way you'd notice if you were watching me. My thumb stopped moving on the screen. My shoulders stiffened. I held my breath without meaning to, waiting for whatever was supposed to come next. Nothing did. No voice followed. No crackle. Just the hum of the store resuming its rhythm, as if the beep had never happened. I stood there for a second longer than necessary, listening. The intercom was old, but it wasn't glitchy. It didn't chirp on its own. If it beeped, someone had pressed the button. That was how it worked. Simple cause and effect. I told myself the same thing anyone would have told themselves. It's a malfunction. I pushed away from the counter and walked toward the back hallway, my footsteps sounding louder than usual on the tile. The door leading back there was exactly how I'd left it closed, locked, the small red indicator on the handle unbroken. I tested it anyway, giving the handle a firm twist. It didn't budge. Locked. I let out a quiet breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The hallway beyond the door was dark, but not ominous. Just empty. Beige walls. A scuffed floor. The mop bucket parked where it always was. The break room light was off. Everything felt static preserved. I turned around and went back to the counter, feeling faintly foolish for checking it all. When I glanced at the camera monitor, it gave me exactly what I expected. No motion detected. All 4 boxes. Clean. Empty. The parking lot camera showed nothing but darkness, and my own reflection faintly superimposed on the glass. The stockroom feed was still. The aisle camera showed rows of chips and candy standing at attention like soldiers. There, it was confirmation. Proof that I hadn't missed anything, that nothing was wrong. My heart rate slowed. My shoulders loosened. I laughed softly to myself, the sound barely audible over the hum of the lights. "Get a grip," I muttered. I went back to what I was doing. Refilled the coffee, straightened a rack of jerky, checked the register totals even though I'd already checked them twice. The routine reasserted itself, smoothing over the rough edge the beep had left behind. For the next hour, nothing happened. That almost made it worse. Because once something has pulled your attention, once it's broken, the rhythm even slightly, you don't fully relax again. You just pretend you do. Every sound gets a second look. Every pause feels longer than it should. I found myself glancing at the back hallway door, more often noticing details I'd stopped noticing weeks ago. The scratch near the handle, the faint outline where old tape residue had collected dust. I checked the cameras again. No motion detected. Good. The second beep came while I was counting cigarettes behind the counter. I was halfway through the menthol's fingers moving automatically when the intercom chirped again. Same sound, same tone. One sharp beep that seemed to come from everywhere at once. This time, my stomach tightened instantly. I didn't freeze. I didn't hold my breath. I turned my head toward the back hallway so fast I nearly knocked the cigarette carton off the counter. My pulse thudded in my ears loud enough that for a second I couldn't hear anything else. Still, no voice. I waited. 5 seconds. 10. The silence stretched uncomfortable now, like a held note that never resolved. The air conditioner cycled on again, the sudden rush of cold air making me flinch. I walked to the door again, slower this time. Deliberate. I checked the lock, then checked it again, pressing my thumb against the metal like I expected it to be warm. Locked. The hallway was unchanged. Empty. Still. I felt ridiculous standing there staring at nothing. I felt exposed, like the act of checking was somehow worse than ignoring it would have been. I went back to the counter and forced myself to look at the cameras before my mind could fill in gaps that didn't need filling. No motion detected. There was a flicker in the corner of the screen, just a blink so fast I might have imagined it, but when I leaned closer, everything was steady again. Grainy. Still. Normal. I told myself I was tired. That explanation fit easily. Overnight shifts mess with your head. They warp your sense of time. Sounds carry differently at night. Old electronics do weird things when they're running nonstop. I'd heard all of that before, had repeated it to myself more than once. By the time the third beep came, I was already prepared to explain it away. It happened sometime after 2, when the store felt like it was floating in a bubble of quiet, so deep it was almost physical. I was mopping near the coolers, the smell of cleaner sharp in my nose, when the intercom chirped again, louder this time, or maybe just louder in my head. I straightened slowly, the mop handle slick in my hands, and looked at the door without moving toward it. "Okay," I said out loud, my voice sounding thin. "Okay." I checked the cameras from across the store, squinting at the monitor like proximity alone might reveal something I'd missed before. No motion detected. Same message. Same empty frames. I didn't go to the door this time. I didn't want to give the sound any more power than it already had. Instead, I finished mopping, dumped the dirty water, and washed my hands longer than necessary, scrubbing at my palms as if the unease might rinse away with the soap. Later, closer to the end of my shift, I did something I hadn't planned on doing. I logged into the system terminal in the back room, the one we rarely touched unless something broke. The screen was slow, the keys sticky. I navigated through menus. I barely understood telling myself I was just curious, just checking. That's when I saw it. A single line in the activity log. Backdoor accessed. No timestamp, no user ID. Just the entry floating there without context, like it had been cut out of the rest of the night. I stared at it for a long moment, my reflection faintly visible in the darkened screen. The hum of the building felt louder back there, more enclosed. I waited for the system to refresh, for the line to disappear or populate with details. It didn't. I logged out and shut the terminal down. When I went back to the counter, the cameras still read, "No motion detected." I told myself the log was a glitch too. I told myself that systems fail, that electronics lie, that the important thing, the visible thing, had stayed consistent all night. I finished my shift, locked up, drove home with the radio on low, the sound filling the car, so I wouldn't have to listen to my own thoughts. At the time, it felt like a minor incident, a footnote, something I could forget by the time I woke up the next afternoon. I didn't understand yet that it wasn't the sound itself that mattered. It was the fact that something had announced itself and then waited for me to explain it away. The register was the one thing I trusted without question. Not the cameras, not the intercom. The register. It was old, slow, and stubborn in a way that made it feel honest. You had to hit the buttons just right, or it wouldn't respond. The screen lagged half a second behind every command. The receipt printer screamed like it was being torn apart every time it spat out a slip of paper. But it never did anything on its own. It never surprised you. If the drawer opened, it was because you opened it. At least that's what I believed. It happened a few nights after the intercom beeps, long enough that I'd mostly convinced myself they were nothing. Long enough that the routine had settled back into place, smoothing over the edges of that unease, like dust covering footprints. I was standing behind the counter, counting a small stack of bills from the cigarette sales, when the register made a sound behind me. A sharp, violent screech, the receipt printer firing up without warning. I spun around so fast, I nearly dropped the money. The printer was feeding paper. White slips spilling out onto the counter, curling as they hit the air. The noise filled the store, cutting straight through the hum of the lights and the steady drone of the AC. It was too loud for the hour, too aggressive, like the register was shouting. Then pop. The cash drawer slid open. Just an inch at first, then fully stopping with a hollow thud that echoed in the quiet space behind the counter. I stood there staring at it, my heart thudding hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. For a second, I honestly thought I might have blacked out, that I'd rung something up and forgotten, that my hands had moved without my brain keeping track. But the counter was clear. No customer, no items, No half-scanned candy bar or bottle sitting there to explain it. Just the open drawer, the printer still whining as it finished its tantrum, and a growing pile of receipts. I stepped closer and picked one up. It was blank. No items. No total. Just the header store name, address date, and a timestamp that made my stomach tighten. 2:41 a.m. I checked the screen on the POS, my fingers hovering just above the keys like I was afraid to touch it. The transaction log showed nothing. No sale, no void, no error message. It was as if the register had decided entirely on its own that it needed to do something. I told myself the same thing I'd been telling myself all week. You're tired. Overnights mess with your head. They blur your sense of cause and effect. I'd heard people talk about micro-sleeps, those moments where your brain shuts down for a second without you realizing it. Maybe that was it. Maybe I'd hit a key without noticing. Maybe my finger had brushed the drawer release while I was counting money. I closed the drawer and felt the familiar resistance as it slid back into place. Solid. Real. I tore off the rest of the receipts and tossed them into the trash, wincing at the sound they made when they hit the empty liner. I forced myself to laugh quietly, the sound dry and unconvincing. Get it together, I said to no one. The store returned to normal almost immediately. The printer went silent. The hum crept back in. The AC sighed overhead. The register screen glowed patiently, waiting for input like it always did. For a while, that was enough. I busied myself with small tasks, moving through them a little faster than usual, like speed might outrun the thought I didn't want to finish. I restocked cups, straightened magazines, checked the bathrooms again. I avoided looking at the register unless I absolutely had to. When I finally did, everything looked fine. It wasn't until closer to the end of the shift that I noticed the money. I counted the drawer the same way I always did, bills first, then coins. My fingers moved automatically, stacking, sorting, keeping track in my head. When I finished, the total didn't line up. It was off by a few dollars. Not much. Just enough to be annoying. Just enough to make you question yourself. I counted it again, slower this time, forcing myself to pay attention to every bill, every coin. I even dumped the change out onto the counter, the metal clinking softly as it spread. Same result. I checked the receipts. Every sale was accounted for. No voids. No suspicious refunds. Nothing that explained the shortage. I stared at the open drawer, heat creeping up the back of my neck. A few dollars wasn't worth reporting. The manager hated paperwork. Everyone knew that drawers came up short sometimes. Coins fell. Bills stuck together. Mistakes happened, especially on nights like this. I closed the drawer and made a note on the shift log, my handwriting tighter than usual. Register short 327. Seeing it written down helped. It turned the problem into something official, something manageable. Numbers instead of feelings. Still, I found myself watching the register more closely after that. Every time I walked past the counter, my eyes flicked toward the drawer, checking to make sure it was still flush with the frame. Every time the printer made even the faintest noise, my shoulders tensed. The sounds of the store seemed sharper now, more defined. The click of the refrigerator compressor sounded closer than before. The beep of the scanner felt louder, almost intrusive. Even the hum of the light seemed to carry a faint, uneven pulse, like it was struggling to stay consistent. Sometime after 3, it happened again. I was mid-step, moving from the back hallway toward the counter, when the register screamed. The receipt printer shrieked to life without warning, the sound so sudden it made me flinch hard enough that my foot slipped. The drawer popped open immediately this time. No hesitation, no build-up. Pop. The sound echoed. I stood there frozen, one hand still gripping the edge of a cardboard box, staring at the open drawer like it had just spoken to me. "No," I said quietly. The word came out before I could stop it. Instinctive. Defensive. I crossed the distance to the counter in 3 long strides and snatched a receipt as it printed, my fingers trembling, just enough to make the paper flutter. Blank. Again. The timestamp was different. 3:09 a.m. I looked at the POS screen. Still nothing. No transaction. No error. Just the same idle display it always showed when it was waiting for input. I closed the drawer harder than I needed to, the sound ringing out louder than the pop that had opened it. My heart was racing now, fast and shallow, my breaths coming too quickly. I told myself it was mechanical. A loose wire, a failing sensor, old equipment doing old equipment things. I told myself I'd mention it to the manager in the morning, and he'd roll his eyes and say he'd call maintenance, and that would be the end of it. But even as I thought that, another part of my brain was counting. 2 receipts, 2 openings, a few dollars missing. The pattern wasn't obvious enough to be meaningful. Not yet. But it was there, hovering just out of reach, like something I couldn't quite focus on. I checked the cameras. No motion detected. All 4 feeds unchanged. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, waiting for it to contradict me, waiting for a flicker, a shadow, anything that would make this make sense. Nothing did. By the time my shift ended, my head ached with the effort of staying calm. I locked the drawer, shut down the register, and printed the end-of-day report with hands that no longer felt steady. The printer's screech made me wince, even though I'd triggered it myself this time. As I turned off the lights and stepped outside into the cool pre-dawn air, I glanced back through the glass at the counter. The register sat dark and silent, exactly where I'd left it. For a moment, I felt foolish again. Dramatic. Exhausted. Ready to forget the whole thing as soon as I crawled into bed. I didn't know yet that the store wasn't malfunctioning. It was responding, and it had started keeping track of me. The cameras were supposed to be simple. That was the comfort of them. 4 lenses, 4 angles, 4 small windows into a world that didn't change unless something entered it. I had learned their limits early on, the blind spots, the slight delay, the way the image softened at the edges like an old memory. They weren't perfect, but they were consistent. And consistency by that point was the only thing keeping my nerves in check. Camera 4 wasn't part of that consistency. It was the one nobody talked about unless someone new asked. The one that sat in the corner of the monitor grid like an afterthought. According to the manager, it had been broken long before I started working nights. A wiring issue. Too expensive to bother fixing. That was the explanation I'd been given, and I accepted it easily because it made sense. Stores like ours didn't fix things unless they had to. Camera 4 was supposed to show the back hallway leading to the stockroom and the employee door. In theory, it covered the most boring stretch of the building. No merchandise, no customers, just beige walls and a scuffed linoleum floor. In practice, the feed was always useless, either frozen on a gray frame or replaced with a blocky no-signal message that no one bothered to remove from the system. I stopped really seeing it after my first week. That's why the flicker caught my attention. It was subtle, just a blink of movement in the corner of my vision. while I was checking the monitor. I leaned closer, squinting. My face reflected faintly in the glass of the screen. The image stabilized immediately. The usual 4 boxes stared back at me, dull and unmoving. Camera 1 register, Camera 2 main aisle, Camera 3 parking lot, Camera 4 static. I told myself I'd imagined it. That explanation came easily now. Too easily. It had become a reflex, the mental equivalent of brushing dust off your sleeve. I turned away from the monitor and went back to my tasks, forcing my focus onto physical things, the weight of a box in my hands, the sound of tape tearing the sting of cardboard against my fingers. Still, I found myself glancing back more often than before. At some point, I realized Camera 4 no longer read "no signal." It didn't announce itself. There was no alert, no sound. The label was just gone. In its place was the same overlay. The other cameras had the same quiet declaration, "no motion detected." I frowned at it, leaning closer. The feed itself didn't look right. The image was darker than the others, grainier, like it was being filmed through smoked glass. The hallway was there, or at least a version of it was. The outline of the mop sink, the corner where the wall bent toward the stockroom. Everything looked slightly skewed, as if the camera were mounted at a wrong angle. I tried to remember what the hallway looked like from that perspective, and couldn't. My first instinct was annoyance. Systems update themselves sometimes. Someone could have reconnected the feed without telling me. Maintenance could have come in during the day. The store ran on patchwork fixes, held together by zip ties and handwritten notes. This wasn't worth getting worked up over. Still, I stood there longer than necessary, watching the empty hallway through a lens that wasn't supposed to work. The image held steady for a full minute. Then it glitched. The screen filled with black and white noise, the kind you don't see much anymore. Thick, crawling static that swallowed the picture whole. The other 3 feeds remained unchanged, calm and empty, their borders framing the chaos in the 4th box. The noise lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then the hallway came back. I exhaled sharply, my breath fogging the screen for a moment. I wiped it away with my sleeve and looked again, half expecting the feed to disappear entirely. It didn't. Camera 4 stayed. I told myself the static explained everything. Loose cable, interference, an old system coughing back to life at random. I told myself that broken things sometimes half fix themselves before failing completely, that it didn't mean anything. But the timing gnawed at me. I'd worked enough nights by then to know the store's rhythms. I knew when the lights flickered, when the AC stuttered, when the refrigerators kicked on too hard and dimmed the aisle for a second. Those things happened in predictable patterns. They had reasons. The static hadn't. Over the next few shifts, I started checking Camera 4 deliberately. Not obsessively, at least not at first. Just enough to reassure myself that it was still empty, still harmless. Every time I looked, the overlay was there. No motion detected. The hallway never changed. And yet the feed felt present. That's the only word I can use for it now. It felt like something that had joined the system rather than something that had been repaired. Like a guest who hadn't been invited but had found a seat anyway. I mentioned it to the manager during a shift change, trying to sound casual. He barely glanced at the monitor. "Huh," he said. "Didn't know they fixed that." "They didn't," I replied. "You said it was broken." He shrugged, already turning away. Must have reset or something. That was the end of the conversation. That should have been the end of it for me too. But it wasn't. because camera 4 didn't behave like the others. The delay was different. When I walked into the hallway to grab supplies, I could see myself enter the frame, but the movement lagged more than usual, stretching my steps into something unnatural. My body seemed to hesitate to smear slightly across the screen before snapping back into focus. Once, I stopped moving entirely and watched. My image on camera 4 kept going for a fraction of a second longer than it should have. I laughed it off, a short, sharp sound that echoed too loudly in the empty store. My nerves were shot. That was all. Lack of sleep playing tricks on my perception. Still, I didn't like turning my back to the monitor anymore. One night, while I was refilling cups near the counter, I heard the faintest crackle from the monitor. I looked up just in time to see camera 4 fill with static again, thicker this time, the noise pulsing like a heartbeat. When the image returned, the hallway looked the same, except the lighting was wrong. It was subtle, but I noticed it immediately. The shadows were deeper, pooling along the baseboards. The far end of the hall looked darker than it should have, like the light wasn't quite reaching it anymore. I walked back there to check. The hallway lights were on, bright, unchanged, no flicker, no dimming. When I turned back toward the counter, the feed on camera 4 showed the hallway exactly as it was supposed to be, bright, flat, empty. I stood there for a long moment, comparing reality to the screen. They didn't match. I didn't tell anyone about that part. Instead, I started navigating the system menus late at night, clicking through options I barely understood. The interface was clunky, the text small and outdated. I found the camera list and scrolled through it, slowly reading each label twice. Camera 1, Camera 2, Camera 3, Camera 4. No warning, no asterisk, no note indicating it was inactive or under maintenance. It was just there, active. I stared at the screen, a cold weight settling in my stomach. Camera 4 hadn't been fixed. It hadn't been added. It had simply started appearing. I logged out of the system and returned to the counter, forcing myself to resume my routine. Wipe, straighten, refill, listen to the hum of the building until it smoothed the edges of my thoughts. But from that night on, whenever I checked the cameras, my eyes went to the fourth box first. And every time it told me the same thing. No motion detected. By then, I was starting to understand that the store wasn't just watching for movement. It was watching with me. And it was learning what I expected to see. I noticed the smell before I noticed anything else. That's how it always happens. With things you don't want to acknowledge, your body reacts first quietly, without asking permission from your thoughts. I had just finished wiping down the counter for the third time that night, my hands moving out of habit, more than necessity, when something unfamiliar cut through the usual mix of burnt coffee and disinfectant. It was faint, but distinct. Cologne. Not strong, not cheap, just enough to register as wrong. I stopped mid-motion, the rag still pressed against the counter, and inhaled slowly through my nose. The smell wasn't coming from the sales floor. It wasn't lingering in the air near the entrance or drifting in from outside. It was deeper than that, warmer, like it had been trapped somewhere and released all at once, from the back. I told myself it was nothing. Someone must have walked through earlier, brushed past the counter, left a trace behind. Smells linger. Buildings absorb things. That explanation slid easily into place, neat and comforting. Still, my feet carried me toward the back hallway before I'd consciously decided to go there. The door was unlocked, just like it always was during my shift. I pushed it open and stepped into the narrow corridor, the overhead lights buzzing softly. The smell grew stronger, immediately blooming in the confined space. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was unmistakable now. Clean, masculine, purposeful. It didn't belong to me. I walked slowly, my shoes scuffing against the linoleum, every sound suddenly too loud in the enclosed space. The mop bucket sat where I'd left it earlier. The storage shelves were unchanged. Nothing looked disturbed. Then I reached the break room. The door was open. That alone wasn't unusual. I often left it that way, but something about the angle made me pause. It wasn't wide open or barely cracked. It sat somewhere in between, as if someone had pushed it and then stopped halfway, changing their mind. The smell was strongest here. I stepped inside. The break room was small, barely big enough for the plastic table, the two folding chairs, and the dented vending machine that hummed quietly against the wall. A single fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, unforgiving glow that left nowhere to hide. My eyes went immediately to the chair. One of them, normally tucked under the table, was pulled out. Not much. Just enough to suggest it had been used. I stood there staring at it, my brain scrambling for explanations that didn't involve finishing the thought forming in the back of my mind. Maybe I'd moved it earlier and forgotten. Maybe I'd kicked it with my foot while cleaning. Maybe it had shifted on its own. I didn't believe any of that. On the table sat a paper cup. White. Plain. The store logo printed on the side. Half full. I reached out and hovered my hand over it, close enough to feel the faint heat rising from the lid. Warm. Not hot, but definitely not cold. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the cologne, creating a combination that made my stomach tighten. I hadn't made coffee recently. I knew that. The last pot I'd brewed was over an hour ago, and I'd poured myself the final cup not long after. I remembered dumping the rest down the sink. Remembered watching the dark liquid swirl away. I picked up the cup slowly, my fingers brushing the cardboard. It was warm all the way around. My heart started to pound hard enough that I could feel it in my wrists. I stood there longer than I should have, holding that cup, staring at the chair, breathing in a smell that didn't belong to the building. The hum of the vending machine filled the silence, steady and indifferent. Somewhere out front, the refrigerator compressors clicked on again, right on schedule. The world was behaving normally. I wasn't. I set the cup back down carefully, as if sudden movements might break whatever fragile illusion I was clinging to. I pushed the chair back under the table with my foot, aligning it the way it was supposed to be, the scrape of metal against tile making me flinch. I told myself someone must have come in earlier while I was busy. A delivery guy, maintenance, anyone. Someone I hadn't seen because I wasn't paying attention. That explanation made sense if I didn't examine it too closely. But I had examined it. The front door chime hadn't rung. The cameras hadn't shown movement. The register hadn't logged a sale. The back door was still locked. I left the break room quickly, the smell clinging to my clothes as I stepped back into the hallway. I shut the door behind me harder than necessary, the sound echoing in the narrow space. When I reached the counter, I glanced instinctively at the camera monitor. No motion detected. All 4 feeds, including camera 4. I stared at the screen, waiting for something to change. Waiting for a delayed image of someone slipping out of frame. Waiting for the system to admit I wasn't alone. Nothing happened. The parking lot was empty. The aisles were clear. The hallway camera showed the break room door, now closed. The chair, neatly tucked in the table, empty. The cup wasn't visible from that angle, but somehow that made it worse. I leaned against the counter and closed my eyes for a moment, pressing my fingertips into the laminate until it grounded me. My thoughts raced, looping back on themselves, each explanation unraveling as soon as I tried to hold on to it. You're tired. You're imagining things. You forgot. All of them sounded thin now. I opened my eyes and forced myself to keep working. Straighten, refill, wipe. I clung to the routine, like a life raft, moving through the motions faster than usual, as if speed could keep me ahead of whatever I didn't want to face. But the smell followed me. It lingered faintly in the back hallway, then seemed to trail me onto the sales floor, ghosting through the air whenever I passed near the employee door. Every time I caught a hint of it, my chest tightened all over again. I didn't go back into the break room for the rest of the night. I avoided looking at the table, avoided thinking about the warmth of that cup, about how recent it had felt. I avoided adding up the small details that on their own could be dismissed, but together form something I didn't have a name for yet. Sometime near the end of the shift, while I was standing behind the counter, pretending to read a magazine, the thought finally surfaced, fully formed. I'm not alone. It wasn't a panic. It wasn't even a shock. It was a quiet realization, heavy and undeniable, settling into place, like a truth that had been waiting patiently for me to catch up. I knew I wasn't alone, and still, I didn't say it out loud, because saying it would have made it real, and as long as it stayed unspoken, I could keep working, keep breathing, keep telling myself that the store was the same as it had always been. But the smell in the break room didn't fade. It stayed with me long after I clocked out, lingering in my nose as I locked the doors and stepped into the cold night air. And no matter how deeply I breathed, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else had been breathing there too. The night I stopped trusting my eyes was the night I started listening too closely. By then, my relationship with the store had changed. It wasn't comfort anymore. It was vigilance, pretending to be routine. I still wiped the counters, still refilled the coffee, still checked the cameras on schedule, but every action felt rehearsed, like I was performing normalcy instead of living it. I smiled at my own reflection in the glass doors, nodded to an empty aisle, as if it were a person, kept my voice steady when I spoke out loud, just to hear something human in the space. The sounds, though, were harder to control. They crept in when I wasn't ready for them, slipping between the familiar hums and clicks I'd grown used to. At first, I thought it was just my imagination sharpening itself, turning background noise into patterns that didn't exist. That's what paranoia does. It fills the gaps with meaning. But footsteps are different. You don't confuse them with machinery. You don't mistake them for airflow or old pipes. Footsteps have rhythm, weight, intention. The first time I heard them, I was restocking shelves near the back of the store, my back turned toward the main aisle. A box of snack cakes sat open at my feet, cardboard flaps brushing my ankles as I bent down. I remember humming quietly to myself off-key, just to fill the silence. That's when I heard it. A step. Not loud, not rushed, just the soft, unmistakable sound of a shoe pressing down on tile somewhere behind me. I froze mid-motion, one hand still inside the box. I waited for the door chime, for the cheerful ding that meant a customer had walked in. It didn't come. The store stayed sealed in its artificial quiet, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. Another step followed, closer this time. I straightened slowly, my heart beginning to beat harder, each pulse loud in my ears. I told myself it was nothing, that the sound had come from the refrigerators cycling on, that maybe I'd shifted my weight and convinced myself it was something else. Still, I turned my head slightly, just enough to glance down the aisle through the narrow gap between shelves. It was empty. The long, straight aisle stretched out exactly as it always did, bright, orderly, untouched. No shadows moving, no figures retreating, no sign that anyone had been there at all. I exhaled, embarrassed by the rush of adrenaline flooding my system. My nerves were shot. That was all. Anyone would be jumpy after weeks of bad sleep and too much caffeine. I bent back down to finish stocking. The footsteps resumed immediately. This time, there was no denying them. They moved at a measured pace, heel to toe each step, landing with a soft, deliberate sound that echoed just enough to feel real. I could tell where they were without looking parallel to me, just on the other side of the shelf, close enough that if I stepped sideways, I'd collide with whoever was making them. I straightened again, faster this time, and turned fully toward the aisle. Nothing. The shelves stood in neat rows, labels facing forward, products untouched. The air felt still heavy, like it does before a storm. I stood there staring, waiting for movement that never came. My gaze flicked instinctively to the camera monitor across the store. No motion detected. All 4 feeds, including the aisle I was standing in. My stomach dropped. I looked back toward the shelves, then back at the monitor, comparing reality to the screen like I'd done with the hallway before. The camera showed me alone, a blurred figure standing rigidly in the aisle. No one behind me. No shadow trailing my movements. Another step sounded. It came from directly behind me. I spun around so fast my shoulder clipped the edge of the shelf, sending a row of candy bars rattling. My breath hitched sharp and painful as I braced myself for something to be there. The aisle was empty. I stood there, heart-racing fingers digging into my palms. The footsteps had stopped, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt artificial, like the store was holding its breath. I checked the cameras again, my hands trembling as I leaned closer to the screen. No motion detected. The message felt mocking now. I laughed, a short, brittle sound that didn't reach my eyes. "Okay," I said out loud, my voice echoing faintly. "Okay." I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Old buildings amplify sound. Shelves carry vibrations. My own movements could be echoing back to me in ways I didn't understand. Fear makes you fill in blanks. I forced myself to keep working. That was the mistake. The footsteps followed me. Not constantly, not loudly, just enough to make sure I noticed them. When I moved toward the front of the store, they seemed to trail a few seconds behind. When I stopped, they stopped. When I turned, they shifted, always staying just out of sight, just beyond the reach of the cameras. At one point, I tested it. I stood perfectly still in the center of the aisle, arms at my sides, eyes locked on the shelf across from me. I slowed my breathing, focusing on the steady hum of the lights, the distant click of a compressor. I waited. Nothing happened. I started to relax. Then a single step sounded from the far end of the aisle, heavy enough to vibrate faintly through the floor. I didn't move. The next step came closer. Still no movement on the cameras. I felt something cold settle into my chest, then heavier than fear. Understanding. The sickening realization that whatever was making those sounds didn't exist in the way I needed it to. It wasn't lining up with the world the cameras showed me. It wasn't behaving like a person or a shadow or a trick of the light. It was there, but not where I could see it. I broke. I walked quickly, almost ran to the counter, and planted myself behind it, putting solid distance between me and the shelves. My hands shook as I gripped the edge, grounding myself in something solid and real. I stared at the monitor, watching the feeds cycle through their silent loops. The store looked empty. The footsteps stopped. For a while, nothing happened. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Time felt slippery, unreliable. My breathing slowed. My heart rate followed. I began to wonder if I'd finally crossed some invisible line into exhaustion-induced hallucination. Then from somewhere just beyond the shelves, I heard it again. One slow step, then another. I didn't look away from the cameras this time. They showed nothing. That was when I understood what had changed. It wasn't that the store was hiding something from the cameras. It was that I'd started noticing the difference between what I heard and what I was allowed to see. And once you notice that difference, you can't unnotice it. The footsteps continued soft and patient, moving through blind spots that shouldn't have existed, keeping perfect time with my fear. I stayed behind the counter until my shift ended, eyes glued to the monitor, ears straining for every sound. Because at that point, I trusted the footsteps more than I trusted my eyes. And whatever was walking behind those shelves knew it. There's a difference between being scared and being addressed. Fear can stay abstract. It can hover in the corners, hide behind sounds and shadows. You can tell yourself it's exhaustion, imagination, bad lighting. You can argue with it. But the moment something speaks to you specifically, there's nowhere left to retreat. I learned that the hard way. It was a little after 3, the hour when the night feels stretched thin, when your body wants sleep, but your mind won't let go. I was behind the counter, leaning forward, with my palms flat on the surface, watching the camera monitor like it was a shoreline, and I was drifting farther from it by the second. The footsteps had stopped again, leaving behind an uneasy calm that felt more threatening than the noise had. The store hummed steadily. The air conditioner sighed. The refrigerators clicked on in sequence. Everything sounded normal enough that I almost let myself relax. Then the intercom beeped, not the sharp, accidental chirp I'd heard before. This one was deliberate. A clean, controlled beep that echoed through the store and immediately pulled my spine straight. I didn't move. I didn't look at the hallway or the cameras. I kept my eyes fixed on the counter in front of me, staring at a small scratch in the laminate like it could anchor me there. The speaker crackled softly. Then a voice came through. "Hey." It was calm, casual, the kind of tone someone uses when they don't want to startle you, when they assume they have your attention already. I felt my pulse jump hard enough to make my vision blur at the edges. Before I could decide whether to respond or even breathe, the voice spoke again. It said my name, not shouted, not whispered, just spoken clearly and correctly as if it had been practiced. I won't write it here. Seeing it on the page still makes my stomach tighten, but hearing it in that empty store, carried through the ceiling, speakers stripped of any emotion, it did something to me. It bypassed fear and went straight to recognition. This wasn't random. This wasn't a glitch. I swallowed my mouth suddenly dry. Yeah, I heard myself say the word slipping out before I could stop it. My voice sounded smaller than I expected, thin and brittle in the open space. There was a pause. Long enough that I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. Long enough that hope crept in, fragile and stupid. Then the voice responded, "You don't have to stay up so late." It wasn't threatening. It wasn't urgent. If anything, it sounded considerate, almost kind. The way a coworker might talk to you when they notice you're exhausted. My heart began to pound again, faster this time, each beat heavy and insistent. I looked up at the camera monitor, my eyes darting across the 4 feeds, searching for movement, for proof that someone was where they shouldn't be. No motion detected. The words glowed steadily, indifferent to the way my hands had started to shake. "That's not funny," I said, forcing a laugh that came out wrong. I didn't know who I was talking to. The store, the voice, myself. "If you're messing with the system, just stop." Another pause. When the voice came back, it was closer somehow. Not louder, closer. As if the speakers had leaned in. "I'm not messing with anything." My breath caught. I felt a chill slide down my back, cold and deliberate, like a finger tracing my spine. The voice didn't belong to anyone I knew. It wasn't the manager's gravelly tone, or the clipped way he talked when he was annoyed. It wasn't distorted enough to be a prank through a phone line. It sounded present, grounded, real. "How do you know my name?" I asked, and immediately regretted it. The question hung in the air, exposing how much control I'd already lost. The intercom crackled softly, like someone adjusting their grip on a button. "You wear it?" the voice said. I glanced down at my chest, without thinking, my fingers brushing the edge of my name tag. The plastic felt cold against my skin. I took a step backward, bumping into the cigarette display behind me. The racks rattled quietly, the sound absurdly loud in the tense silence that followed. I could hear my own breathing, now shallow and uneven. "Where are you?" I asked. The answer came too quickly. "Right here." The lights didn't flicker. The cameras didn't change. Nothing in the store reacted except me. I felt a pressure, then not physical, not exactly, but unmistakable. The sensation of being observed from multiple angles at once. Not watched, like a customer watches you from the aisle, but tracked, accounted for. My eyes flicked to camera 4. The hallway feed was empty, still, grainy. The same dull beige walls, the same closed doors. I reached for the phone under the counter, my fingers brushing the plastic before I hesitated. Calling the police felt ridiculous. Calling the manager felt impossible. I didn't even know what I would say. Before I could decide, the intercom spoke again. "You don't need to call anyone," the voice said gently. "There's no microphone on the system at night." The words landed slowly, each one heavier than the last. "No microphone." I repeated quietly, my mind scrambling to catch up. The voice didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched thick and oppressive, broken only by the hum of the building. My thoughts raced, piecing together fragments I'd ignored before, things the manager had said, in passing complaints, about old wiring jokes, about the system being half dead after midnight. There was no mic. I knew that. I'd known it without really knowing it. The intercom button in the back hallway didn't transmit sound during overnight hours. It was wired for emergencies, only one way, meant to broadcast pre-recorded messages or alarms. It couldn't carry a live voice, and yet, my name had come through it anyway. I backed away from the counter, my legs unsteady, until I felt the solid resistance of the wall behind me. I pressed my shoulders against it, grounding myself in the cold cinder block, trying to slow my breathing. "This isn't happening," I whispered. The speaker crackled softly, like it had heard me. For a moment, I thought the voice might speak again. I braced myself for it, muscles tight, every nerve screaming. But nothing came. The intercom fell silent, leaving behind an absence that felt heavier than the sound had. I stood there for a long time, staring at the monitor, waiting for the words, "No motion detected," to mean something again. They didn't. Eventually, the store settled back into its routine. The AC hummed. The refrigerators clicked. The lights buzzed faintly overhead. The world resumed its imitation of normalcy, as if daring me to accept it. I didn't respond to the intercom again that night. I didn't speak, unless I absolutely had to. Because somewhere between the sound of my name and the explanation that shouldn't have been possible, something fundamental had shifted. The store wasn't just reacting to me anymore. It knew who I was, and it had decided that knowing my name was enough. After the voice said my name, I couldn't stop checking the cameras. It wasn't a choice. It was a compulsion, like touching a sore tooth with your tongue, even though you know it's going to hurt. My eyes kept drifting back to the monitor in the corner, drawn there by something deeper than fear. A need to confirm reality. A need to see proof that the store still followed rules. I told myself that if I could see it, whatever it was, I could handle it. The monitor glowed softly against the dim store, its 4 boxes steady and quiet. Camera 1 showed the counter and my own tense posture behind it. Camera 2 showed the main aisle shelves, neat and untouched. Camera 3 showed the parking lot still empty, the pavement reflecting the fluorescent lights like dull water. Then there was camera 4, the back area, the stock room. I hadn't realized how long I'd been avoiding that feed until I forced myself to look directly at it. The image was darker than the others, the contrast slightly off, shadows pooling where they shouldn't. The grain crawled subtly across the screen like static trying to break through, but never quite succeeding. At first I thought it was empty. Then my eyes adjusted. At the far end of the stockroom, near the metal shelves stacked with boxes, there was a shape. It didn't move. That was what made it visible. A human outline, just distinct enough to separate itself from the darkness behind it. Tall, narrow, standing where the aisle narrowed and the light barely reached. No features, no details. Just a silhouette that didn't belong to the shelves or the walls. I leaned closer to the monitor, my breath shallow, my pulse hammering in my ears. The screen reflected my face back at me, wide eyes, pale skin, mouth slightly open, layered over the image, like a ghost of my own making. The figure didn't react. It didn't shift its weight. It didn't turn its head. It just stood there perfectly still, as if it had been waiting for me to notice it. I whispered, "No," and didn't recognize my own voice. My hand moved, without conscious thought, slamming the edge of the counter hard enough to sting. The sharp pain grounded me for half a second. I blinked and looked back at the monitor. The stockroom was empty. The shelves stood in their usual lines. The boxes were stacked exactly as I'd left them. The far corner was nothing but shadow and concrete. I stared, my eyes burning, scanning every inch of the feed. Nothing. My stomach twisted violently, nausea rising fast and hot. I looked away from the monitor and turned my head toward the back of the store, toward the physical door that led to the stockroom. It was closed, locked. Dark beyond the small window set into it. I stood there caught between 2 versions of the same place, neither of which I trusted anymore. "Get it together," I said under my breath, louder this time. "You're exhausted. You're seeing things." I said it like an order. I walked toward the back, each step heavy and deliberate, my shoes sounding too loud on the tile. The closer I got to the door, the more aware I became of my own body, my breathing, my heartbeat, the way my shoulders tensed as if preparing for impact. I stopped just short of the door and listened. Nothing. No footsteps. No movement. Just the distant hum of the building, steady and uncaring. I turned around and went back to the counter, relief and embarrassment tangling together in my chest. I forced myself to look at the monitor again to prove that the image had been a trick of shadow and fatigue. Camera 4 showed the empty stockroom. I almost laughed. The sound caught in my throat when the feed glitched. Not static this time, not noise. The image darkened suddenly, as if the lights in the stockroom had been switched off all at once. The shelves faded into black shapes. The far end of the room disappeared, completely swallowed by shadow. I stared at it, my mind racing. The stockroom lights were on a motion sensor. They didn't just turn off. Not unless someone had been standing still long enough to fool them, or had never triggered them at all. I turned my head toward the back door again. The window was pitch black. A cold wave rolled through me, slow and deliberate. My skin prickled. I took a step back, then another, until I was pressed against the counter again, my eyes locked on the monitor. The darkness on camera 4 seemed thicker now, more complete. The grain intensified, crawling across the black like insects. I leaned in closer, squinting, searching for movement. That's when I heard it. Breathing. At first, I thought it was mine, fast, shallow, uneven. Panic has a way of making you hyper-aware of yourself. I held my breath just for a second to prove it. The sound continued. Slow, controlled, close. It wasn't coming from the speakers. It wasn't amplified or distorted. It was behind me. I realized then that the breathing didn't match my rhythm. I heard breathing and realized it wasn't mine. The words slammed into my mind, fully formed, cold, and undeniable. I spun around my heart, trying to tear its way out of my chest. The store behind me was exactly the same as it had been moments before, bright, empty, silent. The aisles stretched out in neat rows. The front windows reflected my own terrified expression back at me. The breathing stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I turned back to the monitor, slowly, dread pooling heavy and thick in my gut. Camera 4 was still dark. No outline, no movement, just blackness where the stockroom should have been. Then right at the edge of the frame, something shifted. Not a step, not a shape. A subtle change in the darkness, like a presence pulling back just far enough to avoid being seen. The lights in the stockroom snapped back on. The image cleared. Empty shelves, stacked boxes, concrete floor, nothing else. I stood there shaking my hands, clenched so tightly my nails bit into my palms. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to leave the store, and never come back. But my feet stayed planted, trapped by the same logic that had kept me there all night. If you don't see it, it can't hurt you. I didn't trust that thought anymore. From that moment on, the cameras stopped being reassurance. They became witnesses, unreliable ones, but witnesses all the same. They showed me fragments, hints just enough to confirm that something was there without ever letting me understand it fully. The store had crossed a line. It wasn't just responding now. It was hiding things from me on purpose. And whatever had been standing at the end of that stockroom knew exactly when to step back into the dark. I didn't notice the pattern right away. If I'm being honest, I didn't want to notice it. Patterns make things real. Patterns turn coincidence into intention, and intention is the one thing you can't laugh off. when you're alone in a building that never sleeps. But by the time it reached that night, the number had already started living in the back of my mind. 317. It wasn't a superstition. It wasn't something I'd read online or heard on a podcast. It was just a time that kept showing up quietly, like a stain you keep finding in the same place, no matter how many times you scrub. The register popping open on its own. One of the receipts had been stamped 309, another 241. The intercom beeps. I hadn't written the times down, but I remembered the way the store looked, how the night outside the windows had stopped feeling like night and started feeling like a blank wall. The break room cup still warm. That had been a little after 3, I was sure of it, because the radio station I kept low on my phone switched to the same late-night talk segment at 3:00. The footsteps behind the shelves. I'd checked the camera monitor so many times my eyes burned, and every time I looked at the clock, I saw minutes bleeding toward the same point. 317 wasn't magic. It was worse than magic. It was consistent. That night started like the others. That was the cruel part the store still offered me. The illusion of routine still tried to pretend we were doing the same dance we always did. I brewed coffee. I wiped the counter. I faced the shelves. I checked the cameras. I told myself with the stubbornness of someone who's already invested too much pride in being fine that I could make it through one more shift and then talk to the manager in the morning, that I'd demand maintenance, that I'd demand someone else cover nights until the system was fixed, that I wasn't going to be the person who got scared and quit. I kept my phone on the counter this time, screen up, brightness low. I didn't have good reception inside the building, but I wanted it close anyway. Like having it there meant I wasn't truly alone. The store was emptier than usual. Even the late-night regulars didn't come in. No door chime, no quiet nods, no mumbled thanks. Just the hum, the click, the buzz, and the steady fluorescent light washing the world in pale color. I watched the clock without meaning to. It was one of those cheap wall clocks with a second hand that ticked too loudly when the store was quiet. I'd never noticed it before these weeks. Now the sound felt amplified, each tick a small push forward, whether I wanted it or not. Tick, tick, tick. At 3:05, I checked the cameras again, forcing myself to do it like it was normal, like I wasn't bracing for something. No motion detected. Camera 4 looked darker than the others, like always, but stable. At 3:10, I walked to the back hallway and tested the stockroom door handle just to reassure myself it was locked. It was. The metal felt cold. The lock didn't budge. The hallway smelled faintly of bleach and something I didn't want to name. At 3:13, the air conditioner stuttered. It didn't shut off completely. It just faltered for a half second, like someone had pinched the power line. The hum dipped and returned, and in that momentary drop in noise, I heard something else, something the AC normally drowned out. A soft vibration, a low metallic tremor, faint but steady, coming from the back of the store. I stood still, head tilted, slightly listening. It stopped when the AC resumed its full hum, as if it had been waiting for the quiet. My mouth went dry. I turned toward the camera monitor, eyes narrowing, and watched camera 4. The hallway feed looked unchanged. The door at the far end was shut. The shadows were still. The overlay still read the same indifferent words, no motion detected. I glanced at the clock. 3:16. My heartbeat picked up fast and ugly, no longer trying to be subtle. I felt it in my throat, in my fingertips. I tried to swallow and couldn't. The store felt suddenly too bright, too exposed, like the lights were trapping me, instead of protecting me. Tick. 3:17. The stockroom lights went out, not gradually, not with a flicker. 1 second, the feed on camera 4 showed the hallway lit in its flat beige glow, and the next, it was black. A hard cut to darkness, so complete it looked like the camera had died. At the exact same moment, the physical light in the back of the store, visible through the narrow window on the stockroom door, snapped off too. My stomach dropped so fast, it felt like falling. I stared at the door, at that black window, and a cold thought slid into my mind. With absolute clarity, the motion sensors didn't fail. They were being ignored. Then the metal door in the back hallway shuddered. It wasn't loud, not at first. Just a small, controlled vibration, like someone had brushed against it with their shoulder. The sound traveled through the building in a way that made it feel closer than it should have been, like the store's bones were carrying it straight to me. I took a step back from the counter without thinking, my heel catching on the edge of a floor mat. My hands lifted slightly, palms open, as if I could push the air away. The door shuddered again, a little harder this time. The metal didn't rattle like it was being kicked. It trembled like something heavy had leaned into it and then eased off, testing how much it would give. The kind of motion that suggested patience, control. I looked at the cameras, at all of them, my eyes flicking rapidly between the feeds. Camera 1 showed me behind the counter, small and rigid. Camera 2 showed empty aisles. Camera 3 showed the parking lot still dead. Camera 4 was black, not no signal, not static, just darkness. The store around me stayed painfully normal. The refrigerators kept clicking. The ice machine hummed. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly, uncaring. The only thing that had changed was the back of the building, where the lights were out and the door was moving. I tried to tell myself it was a draft, a pressure shift, the AC cycling, anything. But drafts don't move doors in 2 deliberate pulses. The shudder came again, and this time it was followed by a sound I felt more than heard, a low scrape, metal on metal, as if something had dragged lightly across the surface of the door. My skin prickled instantly. The hair on my arms rose. My body recognized the sound as contact, as presence, even as my brain fought to keep it in the realm of maybe. I wanted to run. I wanted to bolt out the front door, into the empty parking lot, into the dark. But the idea of stepping outside felt worse than staying inside. Outside, there would be no fluorescent lights, no cameras, no counter between me and whatever was back there. Just me and the night. I stood, frozen eyes on the stockroom door, waiting for the handle to turn. It didn't. Instead, the door trembled again, smaller this time, almost gentle, like a reminder. And then from somewhere in the darkness behind that door, I heard a sound that made my blood go cold. Not footsteps, breathing, slow, measured. Close enough that for one dizzy second, I thought it had to be coming from the other side of the door window, like someone was standing right there, inches away, exhaling into the glass. I didn't realize I'd stopped breathing until my lungs burned. I forced myself to inhale, shallowly, quietly, terrified that the sound of my breath would somehow invite whatever was back there to respond. The clock ticked again, loud as a gunshot in my head. Tick. I backed away from the counter, one careful step at a time, without turning my back on that door. My fingers brushed the edge of the wall phone by the register, and I almost grabbed it, but my hand wouldn't close. My muscles felt locked, as if my body had decided that stillness was safer than action. The metal door shuddered one last time. Then it went still, The stockroom lights stayed off. Camera 4 stayed black. And the store, with all its familiar sounds, the hum, the click, the buzz, felt like it had shifted into something else. The same building, the same aisles, the same register and coffee and fluorescent glare. But now, it felt like a stage where someone else had stepped into the wings. Someone patient enough to wait for 317. Someone strong enough to make the back door move without ever showing up on camera. And standing there in that bright little fish tank of a store, I understood with sickening certainty that whatever had been watching my routine had finally decided it was time to respond in a way I couldn't ignore. I didn't lock myself in yet, not in this moment, but I remember thinking very clearly, very calmly, as my hands began to shake, if that door opens, I'm not making it to the front. And the worst part was that the store stayed quiet, as if it agreed. The silence after the door stopped moving was worse than the noise itself. It stretched out unnaturally thick and heavy, pressing in on my ears until every small sound felt amplified. The refrigerators clicked on again, obediently resuming their cycle. The ice machine hummed. Somewhere above me, the air conditioner exhaled a long breath, as if the building itself was trying to calm down. I couldn't. I stayed where I was, halfway between the counter and the wall phone. My body angled toward the back of the store, my eyes fixed on the stockroom door. The small window in it was still black, swallowing light instead of reflecting it. I waited for movement, for the handle to turn, for the door to burst open. Nothing happened. Seconds passed, then a minute. My legs started to ache from the tension of holding myself still, but I didn't dare shift my weight. I was acutely aware of my own breathing now, how loud it sounded in my head, how each inhale felt like a risk. I told myself I'd imagined the breathing, that my fear had finally crossed into hallucination, that once I convinced myself of that, the rest would unravel and make sense again. That was when the intercom beeped. Not sharp, not sudden, measured. A clean, controlled beep that rolled through the store like a signal flare. It echoed faintly off the aisles, off the glass of the coolers, off the empty space where customers should have been. I flinched hard enough that my shoulder brushed the wall. The speaker crackled softly, the sound intimate in a way it hadn't been before, like it was clearing its throat. Then the voice came through. "You can finish your shift." It wasn't loud. It wasn't distorted. It didn't carry any of the menace you'd expect from a threat. That was the problem. The voice was calm, even, reasonable. The tone someone uses when they're offering reassurance instead of taking something away. If you heard it out of context, you might think it belonged to a supervisor trying to keep things professional, or a coworker reminding you that the end was in sight. It took me a second to process the words themselves, because my brain was too busy recoiling from how normal they sounded. "I'll lock up," the voice added. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard it stole my breath. I stared at the ceiling speaker above the counter, my vision tunneling my hands, curling into fists without my permission. "No," I whispered. The word barely made it past my lips. The voice didn't respond immediately. It didn't need to. The silence that followed felt intentional, like it was giving me time to accept what had been said, time to realize the implication. You don't need to worry about the end of the night. You're not responsible for closing anymore. I forced myself to speak louder, my voice cracking despite the effort. "That's not funny." I said the same useless line I'd used before. "You need to stop." The speaker crackled again. "I'm not joking. The certainty in those 3 words sent a cold wave through me. There was no amusement there, no anger, just fact. Like gravity, like something stating a rule it expected to be obeyed. I backed away from the wall phone and pressed myself against the counter, gripping the edge until my knuckles ached. My eyes flicked to the camera monitor on instinct, searching for anything movement flicker-proof. No motion detected. The message glowed steadily, unhelpful as ever. "Who are you?" I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. "How are you doing this?" For a moment, I thought the intercom might stay silent. I almost hoped it would. Hope in that moment felt safer than answers. But the speaker crackled again. "You're tired," the voice said. "You've been working too many nights." It was the kind of thing people say when they're pretending to empathize, when they're trying to guide you toward a conclusion they've already reached. My stomach churned. "You don't know that." Another pause, shorter this time. "I do," the voice replied. "I've seen your schedule." Something in my chest twisted sharply, like a muscle pulled too far. My mind raced, grabbing at details, at possibilities. Schedules were posted in the break room. Anyone could see them. That explanation should have been enough. It wasn't. The voice continued, smooth and steady. "You always check the register twice. You refill the coffee, even when it's still half full. You stand behind the counter when you're scared." Each sentence landed heavier than the last, stacking up inside me until my thoughts felt crowded and panicked. Those weren't guesses. They weren't general observations. They were habits. Mine. I felt exposed in a way I couldn't articulate, like the walls had thinned and my routines were suddenly on display. "Stop," I said louder now, my throat tight. "Just stop talking." The intercom went quiet. I stood there shaking, waiting for the next line, bracing for it. My mind spun with possibilities, pranks, recordings, hacked systems, but none of them fit neatly enough to be comforting. Too many things had already crossed lines they shouldn't have. After what felt like a long time, I realized something else. The stockroom door hadn't moved again. The back lights were still off. The breathing was gone. It was as if the voice had replaced all of it. Like whatever force had been testing the physical limits of the store no longer needed to. I swallowed hard and forced myself to move. My legs felt unsteady as I stepped behind the counter and logged into the system terminal, my fingers clumsy on the keys. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for. I just needed something concrete, something that existed in numbers and text instead of sound and shadow. The terminal hummed to life its screen, casting a pale glow on my hands. I navigated through menus faster than before, driven by panic instead of curiosity. My eyes scanned lines of data without really absorbing them. Then I saw it. Under active employees, 2 entries. My name was there exactly where it should have been. Clock in time correct? Status on shift? Below it was another name. Not unfamiliar, not unreadable, just wrong. The clock in time next to it was recent, within the last hour. My stomach dropped. I stared at the screen, willing the second entry to disappear, to resolve into some explanation I could live with. It didn't. The system refreshed automatically the text, blinking briefly before settling back into place. 2 active employees, 1 store, 1 person standing behind the counter. I logged out so fast my fingers slipped the terminal, beeping angrily at the abrupt exit. I backed away from the desk, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The intercom crackled softly. "You see," the voice said. Not triumphantly, not cruelly, just patiently. "You're not alone on the schedule." I felt something inside me finally give way, not into screaming panic, but into a colder, more dangerous understanding. This wasn't someone breaking in. This wasn't someone hiding. This was something that had checked in. Something that believed it belonged there. The voice spoke one last time, quieter now, almost conversational. "Finish your shift," it said again. "You've done this before." The speaker went silent. I stood there in the humming store, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the cameras watching nothing, the system insisting there were two of us working. My hands were shaking too badly to ignore anymore. I backed away from the counter eyes, darting between the stockroom door and the front windows, my mind racing through options that all felt equally impossible. That was the moment the fear shifted. It wasn't just about getting through the night anymore. It was about the realization that whatever had spoken to me didn't think it was threatening me at all. It thought it was helping. And standing there alone in a store that insisted I wasn't, I understood that if I stayed where I was, if I kept following my routine, it would let me finish my shift exactly the way it wanted. I wasn't ready to find out what happened after that. So I made a decision that would change the rest of the night. I stopped trying to prove I was in control. And I started looking for somewhere I could hide. I didn't sprint to the back, like people do in movies. I didn't grab a weapon or shout into the empty aisles. I moved the way you move when your brain finally accepts that panic will get you killed. Slow, careful, trying not to make any sound that could be answered. The break room was the only place in the store that felt like it belonged to me. Not because it was safe, but because it had a door that closed. A cheap, hollow core door, sure, but still a barrier, a boundary, something I could put between myself and the rest of that building. I slipped through the back hallway without looking at camera 4, keeping my eyes forward, my steps light. The hallway lights buzzed faintly overhead. The mop sink and shelves blurred past in my peripheral vision. Every few feet, I caught a whiff of that cologne, again faint but present, and each time it hit my nose, my stomach tightened like a fist. The break room door was closed. I hadn't closed it earlier. My hand hovered near the knob. I stood still listening. The hum of the vending machine was gone. Either it had shut off, or my ears were too full of my own heartbeat to pick it up. From somewhere in the building, the refrigerators clicked on. The sound traveled oddly, as if the store were larger than it should have been. I placed my palm against the door. It was cool, not warm from recent contact. That should have reassured me. It didn't. I turned the knob and pushed it open. The break room was empty. The plastic table, the folding chairs, the curling schedule sheet on the bulletin board, everything looked normal. Too normal. Like a staged version of normal. I stepped inside and shut the door behind me, then immediately locked it, twisting the cheap deadbolt until it clicked into place. The sound was small, but it felt like an announcement. For a moment, I just stood there with my back against the door, breathing hard through my nose, trying to force my lungs to slow down. The fluorescent light overhead flickered, once, then steadied. The air smelled like stale coffee and old paper. No fresh cologne, at least not in here. My phone was in my pocket. My hands were shaking so badly, I fumbled it on the first try, almost dropping it onto the tile. When the screen lit up, the harsh glow made the room feel even smaller. The signal was weak 1 bar, flickering uncertainly, but it was something. I dialed 911. The ringing tone sounded too loud in the enclosed space, each beep scraping against my nerves. I kept my voice low when the dispatcher answered, the way you talk when you're trying not to be overheard. Hi, yeah, I'm at the convenience store on. I gave the address, stumbling over the numbers because my mouth felt numb. I'm working alone, and there's someone in the building. Or something. I heard a voice over the intercom, and the stockroom lights went out. And I stopped swallowing hard. The words sounded ridiculous out loud, even as terror sat heavy in my chest. I'm locked in the break room. The dispatcher's tone stayed steady calm in the way trained voices are. She asked questions I couldn't answer cleanly. Did I see the person? What did they look like? Was there a weapon? Were any doors open? Could I exit the building safely? I stared at the door while she spoke, my eyes fixed on the cheap knob, the thin strip of wood that separated me from the hallway. I didn't see anyone, I admitted. The cameras aren't showing anything. But I heard them. I heard breathing. And the register? My voice cracked. Please just send someone. She told me officers were on the way. She told me to stay where I was. She told me to keep the line open. I tightened my grip on the phone so hard it hurt. For a few seconds, there was nothing but her steady breathing on the other end, and the faint hum of the building pressing in from outside the room. I forced myself to listen for anything else. Footsteps, the intercom, the back door, any proof that I hadn't finally gone insane. That's when I heard it. A sound from the hallway outside the break room. Not footsteps. Metal. A soft scrape like something dragged lightly across a steel surface. It made my skin erupt in goosebumps. I held my breath, listening harder, my ear almost pressing against the door without me realizing it. The sound came again, closer this time, sharper, like a fingernail against metal, like someone testing something, slowly, methodically. Ma'am, the dispatcher asked, "Are you still there?" "Yeah," I whispered. "I'm here." Another scrape followed by a faint hollow tap, tap, tap that traveled through the door and into the room. The tapping wasn't frantic. It wasn't angry. It was patient, almost polite, like a knock you'd give if you expected to be let in. My throat tightened so hard it felt like swallowing glass. Someone's outside the door. I breathed into the phone, the words barely audible. I can hear them. "Do not open it," the dispatcher said immediately, her calm sharpening into authority. "Keep the door locked. Can you move away from the door and put something between you and it?" I looked around, my mind scrambling. The room offered nothing useful. The plastic table was too light. The chairs would fold if you leaned on them. The vending machine was bolted to the wall. I couldn't move it if I tried. I backed away anyway, phone held tight until I was standing near the far corner of the room, my eyes still fixed on the door. The tapping stopped. For a moment, I almost convinced myself it had been the building settling. Pipes, vents, anything that wasn't a person on the other side of that door. Then the deadbolt rattled, just slightly. A tiny vibration that made the metal mechanism buzz in its housing. Not enough to unlock it, just enough to tell me someone had touched it. My blood turned cold. The dispatcher was still talking, asking me to describe my surroundings, telling me to keep breathing, to stay on the line. I didn't answer. I couldn't. All I could hear was the faint sound of metal shifting outside, like something being adjusted in small, careful increments. A soft thud hit the door low, and controlled pressure, not impact, like a shoulder leaning into it. The door flexed almost imperceptibly, and I felt my stomach drop. Then right outside, I heard something else, a familiar electronic chirp, The intercom beep. It came from somewhere in the hallway, not from the ceiling speaker inside the break room. That meant someone was at the intercom panel itself, close enough to press the button. Close enough that if there had been a microphone at night, they could have spoken again. But the speakers stayed silent. Instead, the metal scraping resumed now higher up, like it was coming from the employee door frame or the stockroom door, or something I couldn't see. The noises moved, shifting position in a way that made my skin crawl. It felt like something circling, exploring, learning the layout from the inside. "Officers are 2 minutes out," the dispatcher said. "Stay with me. Do you have a place to hide in that room? A closet?" "There's nowhere," I whispered back. "There's nowhere to go." The deadbolt rattled once more, then stopped. Silence returned so abruptly it made my ears ring. I stood frozen, waiting for the next sound, the next test, the next polite knock. My whole body trembled with the effort of staying quiet. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed steadily. My phone screen glowed in my hand, casting harsh shadows on the walls. Then I heard distant sirens. Faint at first, then louder, approaching quickly. Relief flooded me so hard it made me dizzy. I almost cried. The sound of those sirens felt like a rope thrown into deep water. I heard footsteps outside, not inside this time, but out in the parking lot. Heavy boots on pavement. The front door chime rang once bright and cheerful as ever, and then voices, real voices, muffled through the walls. Police. The dispatcher told me to stay locked in until an officer identified themselves at my door. I did. I stood there shaking phone pressed to my ear, staring at the deadbolt like it was the only thing keeping me alive. A minute later, a knock came firm, authoritative. "Ma'am, this is Officer Reynolds. Can you unlock the door?" My hands fumbled at the lock. It took 2 tries before the deadbolt finally turned. When I opened the break room door, the hallway was full of light and motion. 2 officers' flashlights angled down, hands resting near their belts. Faces serious, but grounded in reality. I stepped out, my knees weak. "It was here," I said immediately, my voice coming out rough. I heard it. I heard someone outside this door. The stockroom lights everything. The officers swept past me, moving with practiced efficiency. They checked the stockroom, first lights snapping back on in a harsh glare. They searched between shelves behind stacked boxes in corners that should have been obvious hiding places. They checked the bathroom. They checked the mop closet. They checked the manager's office. One of them even opened the ceiling access panel in the hallway, shining a flashlight into the dark space above. They found nothing. No person, no open doors, no broken locks, no sign of forced entry. The back door was still secured. The employee exit was still bolted. The windows were intact. The older officer looked at me carefully, his expression shifting into something I recognized too well: professional skepticism dressed up as concern. "You're sure you didn't see anyone?" he asked. "No," I said, my voice tight. "I heard them. I heard breathing. I heard metal, the intercom." He nodded slowly, like he'd heard similar stories from exhausted people in empty buildings. "We're going to take a report," he said. "But right now, there's nobody here." The words hit me like a slap, not because I didn't want to believe them, but because part of me already knew they were going to say that. That was the pattern too. The store did something, the world arrived, and everything returned to normal before anyone else could witness it. As the officers wrote down my information, I glanced toward the counter out front. The camera monitor still glowed quietly in the corner. All 4 feeds. all four stamped with the same message, "No motion detected." And even with police standing in my store, even with their flashlights cutting through the aisles, I couldn't shake the certainty that something had been there moments before, close enough to rattle my lock, close enough to breathe outside my door, then stepped away and vanished the second it heard sirens. I wanted to tell the officers about the system log, about the 2 active employees, about the voice that promised to lock up for me. But my mouth wouldn't form the words, because I could already feel how it would sound. And deep down, underneath the fear, there was a colder thought that settled in as the officers prepared to leave. If it could disappear that easily, it could come back whenever it wanted. After the police left, the store felt wrong in a different way. Not tense, not threatening, just hollow. Like something important had been removed, leaving behind a space that didn't know how to behave without it. The officers' footsteps faded into the parking lot. Their car doors shut. The engine started, and the red and blue reflections slid off the glass windows and disappeared down the road. Then it was just me again. The hum returned, first tentative at first, then steady. The refrigerators clicked back into their familiar cycle. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting the same pale glow they always had. If you walked in at that moment, you would have seen a perfectly normal convenience store at 4 in the morning. No signs of a break-in, no signs of a struggle, no signs of anything out of place, except me. I stood behind the counter arms, folded tightly across my chest, watching the camera monitor like it might change its mind and show me something new, now that witnesses were gone. It didn't. All 4 feeds remained static and empty. The message, "No motion detected," felt less like reassurance now and more like an accusation. One of the officers had suggested I close early and go home. I nodded at the time, grateful for the permission. But when the door finally shut behind them, I realized I couldn't move. The idea of turning my back on the store, of walking out and leaving it alone, felt worse than staying. So I stayed. I told myself I needed answers. That was the excuse. The truth was simpler. I needed proof that I hadn't imagined everything. Something solid. Something I could touch. The system terminal in the back room glowed faintly through the open doorway, its screen still on from earlier. I hadn't shut it down. I hadn't wanted to. It felt like the only thing in the building that might tell me the truth without caring how it made me feel. I walked back there, slowly, listening for any sound that didn't belong. The hallway was quiet. No cologne, no footsteps, no breathing. Just the low electrical hum that made the building feel alive in a way I no longer trusted. I sat down at the terminal and logged in again. My fingers stiff, my movements careful. The screen refreshed lines of text appearing one by one. Inventory, sales, employee access. I hesitated before clicking the last one. Employee access. That was where I'd seen it before. The second name, the second clock in. At the time, panic had kept me from looking too closely. Now, with the store empty and my nerves stretched thin, I forced myself to slow down. The list loaded. 2 entries. My name sat at the top, highlighted in the dull blue that indicated an active shift. Clock in time correct. Status on shift. Below it was the other name. Clear. Undeniable. I stared at it, my mind refusing to connect the letters into meaning at first. I recognized the shape of the name before I recognized the name itself. The way some words feel familiar, even before you remember where you've seen them. I scrolled down, clicked. A small window opened on the screen filled with details: employee ID, access level, badge number, and then in smaller text beneath it, a line that made my stomach drop. Status canceled. I leaned closer, my reflection ghosting across the dark screen. Canceled didn't mean inactive. It didn't mean expired. It meant deliberately shut off, disabled. The date next to it was 6 months old. I swallowed hard and scrolled further, my fingers numb. The system showed the badge had been canceled half a year ago. No access privileges. No authorized hours. No reason it should have been appearing anywhere in the system at all. And yet, according to the log, it had clocked in tonight. I pushed back from the desk, my chair scraping loudly against the tile. The sound made me flinch. I stood there breathing hard, staring at the screen like it might change if I looked away long enough. It didn't. The name stayed. I recognized it now. It belonged to the overnight employee who'd worked before me. The one whose name had faintly scarred the old schedule sheets on the bulletin board. The one the manager had shrugged about. He just stopped showing up. At the time, I'd taken that at face value. People quit all the time, especially on nights, especially at places like this. But seeing the name here, seeing it active, seeing it marked canceled, made that casual explanation feel thin and dishonest. I clicked through more menus, my heart pounding harder with each page. Time logs, access attempts, door interactions. The badge had been used tonight, not just once, multiple times. Each entry was clean, clinical, stripped of emotion. Back hallway access, stockroom proximity, intercom panel interaction. No errors, no warnings. The system hadn't flagged any of it as unusual, because from its perspective, it wasn't. I pressed my palms against the desk and closed my eyes, trying to slow my breathing. The room felt too small, the air too thick. My thoughts spiraled, colliding into each other. If the badge was canceled, it shouldn't work. If it didn't work, the system shouldn't recognize it. If the system recognized it, then I stopped that thought before it could finish. I opened my eyes and stared at the screen again, forcing myself to focus on what was actually there instead of what it implied. The badge number was still visible, a long string of digits that meant nothing on their own. Below it was a small note easy to miss. Termination reason: unresolved. Unresolved. Not fired, not resigned, not transferred. Unresolved. I felt a cold ache spread through my chest, slow and heavy. That word sat there like an open wound the system hadn't known how to close. I thought about the breathing outside the break room door, about the way the stockroom lights had shut off exactly at 3:17, about the voice on the intercom, calm and wrong, telling me it would lock up. You've done this before. The phrase echoed in my head, now stripped of its ambiguity. It hadn't been taunting me. It had been stating a fact. I logged out of the terminal and shut it down the screen, going dark with a soft click. The sudden absence of light made the room feel colder, more exposed. I stood there for a moment, listening to the building settle around me. The store didn't feel empty anymore. It felt occupied by absence. I walked back out to the counter, my steps slow and careful, my eyes scanning corners I'd stopped trusting. The camera monitor still showed 4 empty feeds. The clock on the wall ticked forward, uncaring. Dawn was still an hour away. I realized then that the canceled badge wasn't a glitch. It wasn't a leftover data artifact or a system error waiting to be corrected. It was a record, a footprint, something that had been part of the store long enough to learn how it worked. long enough to earn access, long enough to leave a name behind even after it was supposed to be gone. And whatever had clocked in with that badge tonight hadn't done it by accident. It had done it because the system still remembered it, because the store still recognized it as one of its own. Standing there in the quiet fluorescent glow, I understood something that made my hands start to shake all over again. I hadn't been working the overnight shift alone. I had been replacing someone, and according to the system, that someone never really left. Once I had the name, I couldn't leave it alone. It sat in my head like a splinter, small but sharp, impossible to ignore, no matter how carefully I tried to move around it. The idea that someone had worked the same hours I was working now, that they'd stood behind the same counter, listened to the same hum of lights, trusted the same cameras felt unsettling in a way I couldn't quite articulate. Not because people come and go, but because this one hadn't gone the way people usually do. They hadn't quit. They hadn't been fired. They hadn't been transferred or promoted or written up and escorted out with a box of their things. They had simply stopped showing up. The next morning, after my shift finally ended and the sun began to smear pale color across the edges of the parking lot, I didn't go home. I told myself I was too wired to sleep, that I needed caffeine, that staying awake a little longer wouldn't hurt. All of it was a lie I told, so I wouldn't have to be alone with my thoughts. Instead, I stayed. The day crew arrived one by one, yawning, complaining about traffic, talking about nothing. The store filled with noise and movement. Again, the illusion of normal life settling back into place. The cameras suddenly had something to watch. The door chime rang every few minutes. The hum blended into a dull background instead of a presence you could feel. I waited for the manager. When he finally came in, coffee in hand, he looked surprised to see me still there. "Rough night?" he asked casually, already moving toward the office. I followed him in and closed the door behind us. The small space smelled like paper and dust, the faint metallic tang of old electronics. He sat down at his desk and booted up his computer, not looking at me. "I need to ask you something," I said. He glanced up, then just briefly. Yeah, I told him the name. Not dramatically, not accusingly. I said it like it was a normal question, like I was asking about a scheduling change or a missing shipment. For the first time since I'd started working there, he froze. It wasn't obvious. Just a slight pause, a fraction of a second, where his fingers stopped moving over the keyboard. But I saw it. I was watching too closely now to miss things like that. He cleared his throat. "Why are you asking about him?" That answer told me more than any explanation could have. "You said he used to work overnights," I replied. "I saw his name in the system. That was a mistake." The air in the office changed, immediately thickening, as if the door had been shut too firmly. The manager leaned back in his chair, studying me in a way he hadn't before. Not annoyed, not concerned, cautious. "I don't know why his name would be in there," he said after a moment. "He's not an employee anymore." "But he didn't quit," I pressed. "There's no termination record, just unresolved." His jaw tightened. He looked away from me, eyes flicking toward the closed office door as if checking that no one was listening. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "We don't talk about that," he said. The words were quiet but final. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "Why not?" He sighed, rubbing his face with both hands like he was suddenly very tired. "Because there's nothing to talk about." He stopped coming in. "That's it?" "That's not it," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. People don't just stop showing up without telling anyone. Not for weeks, not for months. He looked at me sharply then. You don't know that. I held his gaze. Did you file paperwork? He hesitated again. No, he admitted. There was no exit interview, no formal resignation. HR told us to mark him inactive after a while. That's all. After how long he didn't answer right away. When he did, it was barely above a whisper. After he missed 3 shifts in a row. 3 shifts. That was it. I thought about the hours between midnight and dawn. About how isolated they were. About how easy it would be for someone to disappear into that time and never quite come back out. The idea made my stomach twist. Did anyone check on him, I asked. The manager's expression hardened. That's not our responsibility. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him about the voice, about the badge, about the system insisting there were 2 of us working. But something in his posture stopped me. He wasn't going to hear it. And worse, he might already know. I left the office without another word. Over the next few days, I asked around, casually, carefully. I mentioned the name to the day shift, to the afternoon crew, to people who'd been there longer than me. Every conversation followed the same pattern. A pause, a glance away, a shrug. Oh yeah, someone would say. That guy. Then nothing. No stories. No complaints. No gossip. Not even the usual workplace, grumbling about someone who'd made their job harder by quitting without notice. It was like he'd never existed in a way that mattered, except the store remembered him. I found old schedules in the break room, curling sheets pinned to the bulletin board behind newer ones. If you peeled them back carefully, you could see his name written in thick marker across the overnight slot. Sometimes crossed out, sometimes not. The paper beneath was scarred where the marker had pressed too hard a faint impression that never fully disappeared. I found his name on a maintenance request from a year ago, on a training checklist initialed and dated, on a sticky note stuck to the side of the office printer with a half-faded reminder written in block letters, lock up back hallway. No one remembered writing it. No one remembered him leaving. The longer I looked, the clearer it became that the store hadn't treated his disappearance like an emergency. It had treated it like an inconvenience. Something that would resolve itself if ignored long enough. I thought about the badge again. Canceled, but not erased. The way the system still recognized it. The way it had logged access like nothing was wrong. That night, as I worked another overnight shift, I felt the weight of that knowledge settle in. Every sound felt heavier. Every shadow felt deeper. I wasn't just scared of what was happening to me anymore. I was scared of what had happened before. Because whatever had worked those shifts before me hadn't been escorted out, hadn't handed in their badge, hadn't been properly removed from the system. They'd simply stopped showing up. And the store, its cameras, its doors, its logs had never really accepted that absence. Standing behind the counter, watching the clock crawl toward the same familiar hour, I realized something that made my chest tighten with dread. If no one talked about him, if no one remembered how he left, then no one would notice if it happened again. Not to me. Not to anyone who took over the night shift after. By the time I realized no one was going to give me answers willingly, I stopped asking questions out loud. Not because my curiosity faded, but because I could feel the resistance every time I came close to the subject. It was subtle people shifting their weight, changing the topic too quickly, suddenly remembering something urgent they needed to do. The kind of avoidance that isn't coordinated but instinctive, as if everyone had learned separately that certain things were better left untouched. The manager was the worst about it. After that first conversation in his office, he made a point of keeping our interactions brief, polite, transactional. He stuck to schedules and inventory and nothing else. If I lingered too long near the office door, he'd find a reason to step out. If I mentioned anything about systems or logs, he'd nod and say he'd look into it, then never bring it up again. One afternoon, I cornered him by accident, or maybe on purpose. He was digging through a filing cabinet in the back office papers spread across his desk, his tie loosened like he'd been there longer than he wanted to admit. I stood in the doorway, watching him flip through folders with increasing frustration. "What happened to his file?" I asked. He didn't look up. "What file?" "The overnight guy," I said. I didn't say the name this time. I didn't need to. There should be paperwork, HR records, incident reports, something. His hand froze mid-motion, a manila folder half pulled from the drawer. For a second, I thought he might finally explode, tell me to drop it, tell me to mind my own business, tell me I was crossing a line. Instead, he sighed. "They're incomplete," he said quietly. I stepped closer. Incomplete how he shut the drawer and leaned back against the desk, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Some things were never filed. Some things were misplaced. "That doesn't just happen," I said. He looked at me, then really looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something like fear flicker across his face. Not fear of me, but fear of the topic itself. "It does, if enough people want it to," he replied. The words settled heavy between us. I didn't push further. I didn't have to. The implication was clear enough. Whatever had happened during that man's time on the overnight shift had been quietly buried under procedural gaps and administrative shrugs. Not erased, just obscured, lost in the cracks between responsibility and convenience. That night, I went looking on my own. The security office, if you could call it that, was really just a corner of the back room with a monitor and a locked cabinet beneath it. I'd never paid much attention to the cabinet before. It held old backup drives labeled in fading marker with dates and camera numbers, maintenance records, archived footage, the things no one checked unless something went wrong. I unlocked it with the spare key I wasn't technically supposed to use. The drives were stacked neatly, each one cataloged by month. I pulled them out one by one, my fingers brushing dust that hadn't been disturbed in a long time. The labels told a story of dull consistency. March, April. May each drive representing hours upon hours of empty aisles and uneventful nights. I found the month I was looking for. The drive slid out easily, too easily. I plugged it into the terminal and weighted my foot tapping unconsciously against the tile. The system whirred softly as it loaded the archived footage folders, populating the screen in neat rows. Camera 1, Camera 2, Camera 3. I frowned. Camera 4 was missing. I clicked through the folders again, slower this time, checking dates and times. The other feeds were intact grainy footage of the counter, the aisles, the parking lot. Normal nights, nothing remarkable, but every file labeled for the stockroom and back hallway was gone. Not corrupted, not mislabeled, gone. I scrolled down to the date marked as the former overnight employee's last scheduled shift. The folders for that night loaded just like the others. I clicked on camera 1 and watched as a familiar figure moved behind the counter. tired posture, slow movements, the same habits I recognized in myself now. I felt a chill creep up my spine. This was him. I could tell, even without knowing his face clearly. The way he leaned on the counter, the way he checked the register twice, the way he paused occasionally, head tilted like he was listening for something. I clicked on camera 2. The aisles were empty. Camera 3 showed the parking lot, a single car pulling out sometime after midnight. Everything looked painfully normal. Then I tried to access camera 4. A small error message popped up. File not found. I tried again. Different folder, different timestamp, same message. My heart began to pound harder, a slow, heavy rhythm that matched the growing weight in my chest. I leaned closer to the screen, my reflection faint and distorted in the dark glass. Every other night had at least some footage from camera 4, even the broken static-filled ones. But this night, the night he stopped showing up, nothing. I sat back in my chair, the air feeling suddenly thin. Missing footage wasn't unheard of. Drives failed. Files got overwritten. Systems glitched. But patterns don't lie. The camera that shouldn't have worked. The badge that had been canceled but not erased. The employee who never officially left. And now the one thing that could have shown what happened during his final shift was gone. I thought about the voice again, about how calm it sounded, about how familiar it was with routines and schedules and habits, about the way it spoke like someone who had done this job before. You've done this before. The words took on a new shape in my mind. I closed the footage and shut down the terminal, my hands trembling as I unplugged the drive and slid it back into the cabinet. The lock clicked softly. When I turned the key, a small, definitive sound that felt like sealing something away. I understood then why no one talked about it. Because talking would mean admitting that the store didn't just lose an employee. It meant admitting that something had happened during a shift that never ended properly. That the system had been left open. That a presence had been logged, recognized, and never fully removed. If the footage existed, someone would have had to watch it. And if someone had watched it, they would have known exactly why the overnight worker never came back. As I walked back out onto the sales floor, the lights buzzing overhead, I felt a deep, crawling dread settle into my bones. The silence around the subject wasn't ignorance. It was avoidance. Because once you accept that the footage is missing for a reason, there's only one conclusion left that makes any sense at all. The store didn't want anyone to see how the last overnight shift really ended. And standing there replacing someone whose final hours had been erased, I couldn't shake the feeling that the system wasn't hiding the past. It was protecting it from being interrupted again. I didn't quit in a dramatic way. There was no shouting, no confrontation, no moment where I slammed my badge on the counter and stormed out. I put in my notice like a normal person. 2 weeks. Typed, printed, signed. The manager accepted it with visible relief, like he'd been waiting for me to say it first. He didn't ask why. He didn't try to talk me out of it. He just nodded and told me he'd schedule my last overnight shift for the following Friday. That should have been my first warning. The final shift arrived quietly, too quietly. No rain, no wind, no strange customers drifting in at odd hours. The parking lot was empty when I pulled in the asphalt, still warm from the day, reflecting the store's neon sign in soft, distorted streaks. I sat in my car for a full minute before getting out, hands resting on the steering wheel. watching the automatic doors slide open and shut for no one. I remember thinking how peaceful it looked. That thought scared me more than anything else. Inside the store smelled exactly the same as it always had. Old coffee, faint disinfectant, warm plastic from the lights overhead. The hum greeted me, immediately settling into my ears like it belonged there. The clock above the counter ticked steadily. The camera monitor glowed in the corner, its 4 feeds already waiting. I clocked in. The system accepted it without hesitation. No second name appeared. No error. No warning. Just me. I spent the first hour doing everything the way I always had, even though I knew it was pointless. I wiped the counter. I faced the shelves. I refilled the coffee that no one would drink. I checked the bathrooms twice. I kept my movements slow and deliberate, as if rushing might wake something that had decided to sleep through my departure. The store didn't respond. No beeps, no flickers, no footsteps behind the shelves. The intercom stayed silent. Camera 4 showed the back hallway in its usual grainy stillness, darker than the others, but stable. It felt like the calm after a storm that never came. I kept waiting for something to happen. My nerves stretched tight, every sound analyzed and dismissed in the same breath. Each click of the refrigerators made my shoulders tense. Each shift in the AC's hum made my heart jump. But nothing followed. The store behaved itself with unsettling precision. Around 2, I realized my hands had stopped shaking. That scared me too. I leaned against the counter and stared at my reflection in the glass of the cigarette case. I looked tired, hollow, like someone who had stayed too long in a place that didn't want them but hadn't pushed hard enough to make them leave sooner. I checked the cameras again. No motion detected. All 4, including camera 4. I thought about the missing footage, about the canceled badge, about the name that still sat somewhere in the system unresolved. I wondered if the store knew I was leaving. If it understood that this was the last time it would see me behind the counter following the routine it seemed to expect. At 3:00 a.m., I stopped doing busy work and just stood there. The silence pressed in thick and heavy. The clock ticked loudly now, each second painfully distinct. I found myself watching it again despite my best efforts. 3:05, 3:10. My heartbeat picked up involuntarily. I didn't want to look at the back hallway. I didn't want to look at camera 4. I didn't want to think about the number that had started all of this. 3:17. The minute hand crept closer. 3:15. I held my breath, without meaning to my body bracing for the familiar sequence, the lights, the door, the voice. I told myself I wouldn't react this time, that if it happened again, I'd just walk out the front door and never come back. 3:16. Nothing changed. 3:17. The store stayed exactly the same. No lights went out. No doors shuttered. No intercom beep cut through the air. The clock ticked past the minute like it was just another number. 3:18. I exhaled shakily, a laugh bubbling up before I could stop it. The sound echoed too loudly in the empty store. Relief flooded my chest, messy and overwhelming. I leaned forward, hands on the counter, head bowed. "It's over," I whispered. The store didn't answer. The rest of the shift passed in the same uneasy calm. Dawn crept in, slowly lightening the edges of the sky beyond the windows. The neon sign flickered off automatically. The world outside started to look real again, solid and inhabited. When my replacement arrived, I didn't wait around. I gave a brief nod, a rushed explanation of inventory, and grabbed my jacket. I clocked out for the last time, the system chirping softly, as if nothing about this moment mattered. As I walked toward the door, I hesitated. I don't know why. Curiosity, maybe. Or a need for closure I didn't deserve. I turned back toward the counter and glanced at the camera monitor one last time. Camera 1 showed the counter from above, empty now. Camera 2 showed the aisles. Camera 3 showed the parking lot, my car still sitting there. Camera 4, I froze. For just a second, the feed showed movement. Not a full figure, not a clear shape, just a subtle shift in the shadows at the far end of the stockroom, like something stepping back into place. Then the image stabilized. No motion detected. I stood there, heart pounding, waiting for my eyes to betray me again. The screen didn't change. The store didn't react. Get out, I muttered to myself. I turned and walked out without looking back again. I left that job. I moved on. I found another place to work. Day shifts, busy environments, places with windows and people and noise. I stopped waking up at 3:17. I stopped checking corners. I stopped listening for breathing that wasn't mine. Mostly, but sometimes, late at night, my phone buzzes with an email notification I wasn't expecting. A spam message, a system alert, a calendar reminder I don't remember setting. And every once in a while, just often enough to keep the fear alive, I catch myself checking the time. 3:17 a.m. That's when I remember the store didn't react to my final shift the way I thought it would. It didn't fight me. It didn't stop me. It didn't need to. Because whatever had clocked in before me, whatever had learned the routine, had already learned something else too. People leave, but systems don't always log them out. I didn't carry anything with me when I left that job. No badge, no uniform, no keys I wasn't supposed to have. I returned everything, like I was closing a chapter, cleanly, like that mattered. The manager signed off on my paperwork without looking me in the eye, and I walked out into a life that had nothing to do with fluorescent lights or overnight silence. For a while, it worked. Years passed. I moved apartments. I changed jobs twice. I learned what it felt like to sleep through the night again without jolting awake at invisible sounds. I stopped thinking about camera feeds and access logs and stockroom doors. When people asked why I didn't work nights anymore, I laughed and said I'd aged out of it, like it was just a phase I'd grown tired of. Most days, I believed that. The first sound came back during a perfectly ordinary afternoon. I was standing in line at a grocery store scrolling on my phone when I heard it clear as day, sharp and unmistakable. Beep, not the chirp of a scanner, not the tone of a phone notification, the exact electronic chirp of an intercom activating. The kind that carries through a space and announces itself whether you want it to or not. My head snapped up so fast my neck hurt. No one else reacted. The cashier kept talking. The line shuffled forward. The store around me stayed stubbornly normal. I stood there, heart racing, waiting for the sound to repeat. It didn't. I told myself it was memory, association, that my brain had grabbed onto a familiar noise and dressed it up with meaning it didn't deserve. Trauma does that. Everyone knows that. But the explanation didn't sit right, because I hadn't remembered the sound. I'd heard it. After that, the fridge clicks started. Not just any refrigerator. That specific hollow click, the one that happens when a compressor cycles on after a brief pause. I heard it in my apartment late at night, even though my fridge made a completely different sound. I heard it in hotel rooms, in office break rooms, once in a friend's kitchen while we were mid-conversation. Every time my body reacted before my mind could catch up. A spike of adrenaline, a tightening in my chest, the sudden overwhelming urge to check a corner that didn't need checking. The worst were the footsteps. They never came when I was busy or distracted, never when there was enough noise to mask them. They showed up in the quiet moments, the ones you don't think twice about until something breaks the rhythm. Late at night, when I'd get up for water. Early in the morning when the building was still half asleep. Soft steps, controlled, measured, always just out of sync with me. I'd stop walking, heart hammering, and listen. The sound would continue for half a second longer, then fade, like an echo that didn't quite belong to anything solid. I checked my apartment more times than I like to admit. Closets, doors, windows. I installed extra locks, then pretended they were for convenience instead of peace of mind. I told myself it was normal to be cautious. I told myself everyone listens for things when they're alone. But I didn't tell anyone about the intercom, or the way my heart still skipped when I heard certain beeps in public spaces, or the fact that sometimes when I'm drifting off to sleep, I hear breathing that doesn't match my own. Slow, patient, familiar. The sounds never come with images. That's what makes them worse. There's nothing to confront, nothing to argue with. Just the knowledge that my brain recognizes these noises as belonging to a place I left and something that didn't. I tried therapy. I really did. I described the fear in vague terms, careful not to sound ridiculous. Anxiety, lingering stress, hypervigilance, all words that fit well enough to be useful. The coping techniques helped me breathe through the moments, helped me ground myself when my pulse spiked for no visible reason. They didn't make the sound stop. A few months ago, I was staying late at my current job, finishing up paperwork after everyone else had gone home. The building was old, the kind with humming lights and long quiet hallways. I was tired, relaxed in that end-of-day way that lowers your guard. That's when I heard footsteps behind me, clear, close, one step then another. I didn't turn around. I just stood there, pen hovering above the page, listening. My breathing slowed deliberately the way I'd learned to do. The steps continued for exactly one more beat than they should have. Then they stopped. I packed up my things and left without looking back. In my car, with the doors locked and the engine running, I finally allowed myself to think the thought I'd been avoiding for years. What if the sounds aren't following me? What if they never left me in the first place? The store taught me something I didn't understand at the time. That routines imprint, that systems learn patterns, that when something stays long enough, moves the same way, listens to the same hums, breathes the same recycled air, it leaves a trace that doesn't depend on walls or cameras or location. Sometimes late at night when the world is quiet enough, I swear I can still hear the store. Not as a memory, as a presence, an intercom waiting to beep, a refrigerator about to click on, footsteps pacing patiently just out of sight, keeping time with a shift that never really ended. I left that place years ago, but whatever worked nights there learned my habits too well. And now every time the world goes quiet enough, it reminds me of something I don't know how to unlearn. Some sounds don't belong to places. They belong to schedules. And once you've filled a shift long enough, something else can learn how to finish it for you. I don't go into 24-hour stores anymore. I don't make a show of it. I don't tell people it's a rule. I just don't. If I realize a place never closes, I suddenly remember something I need elsewhere. If a gas station looks too quiet, too brightly lit against an empty road, I keep driving. If the parking lot has more lights than cars, my hands tighten on the steering wheel, and I feel that familiar pressure settle in my chest. I learned how to recognize the signs. It's not the darkness that bothers me. It's the opposite. The artificial daylight. The way the fluorescent lights erase shadows, but somehow make the emptiness louder. The way the doors slide open, automatically welcoming you into a space that feels prepared for someone who never arrives. I tell myself, I'm just cautious now. That lots of people avoid late-night places. That nothing about my behavior is irrational. I shop during the day. I get gas before midnight. I plan ahead. Still, every time I pass one of those stores, something in me listens. I catch myself cataloging the sounds, even from outside, the low hum of electricity leaking through the glass, the faint buzz of lights, the barely audible click that happens when a compressor kicks on. Sounds most people don't notice, unless they're standing behind a counter at 3 a.m. with nothing else to focus on. Sometimes I smell old coffee through an open door, and my stomach drops before I can stop it. I haven't worked nights in years, but my body never forgot the schedule. Once a few months ago, I broke my rule by accident. I was driving back from out of town later than I'd planned. The highway was empty, my phone battery was low, and the fuel gauge dipped into a range I didn't like. When I saw the sign for a gas station up ahead, I didn't notice the small lettering underneath until it was too late. Open 24 hours. I almost kept going, but the next exit was miles away, and I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just a store, that this one wasn't the store. Different brand, different layout, different place. I pulled in. The lot was nearly empty. One car parked crooked near the edge, engine off. No one at the pumps. The building glowed too brightly against the dark road, its windows reflecting nothing but my own headlights. I sat in my car for a moment, engine idling, listening. Nothing happened. I got out, filled the tank as fast as I could, and told myself that once I was back on the road, the tension would fade. When I finished, I realized I still needed water. The thought of walking inside made my skin prickle, but dehydration won. The doors slid open with a soft mechanical sigh. Inside, the air was cool and stale. The layout was different, but the feeling wasn't. Bright aisles. Too clean. Too quiet. No music playing. No cashier in sight. I froze just inside the entrance, my eyes adjusting, my ears straining. From somewhere deeper in the store, I heard a sound. Beep. Not loud, not sharp, just enough to register. My heart slammed hard against my ribs. I stood there, breath caught, halfway in, waiting for the follow-up. For a voice, for footsteps, for anything that would confirm I wasn't imagining it. Nothing came. Hello, I called, my voice echoing slightly. A moment passed. Then a young cashier stepped out from behind a shelf, earbuds dangling around his neck. Sorry, he said casually. Didn't hear you come in. I laughed too quickly, nodded, grabbed my water, and paid without looking around any more than I had to. The whole time I felt like I was rushing through a memory that didn't belong to me. Back in my car, hands shaking just slightly, I told myself that was it. A coincidence, a harmless noise, a normal interaction. But the thought followed me all the way home. That store hadn't felt new. It had felt practiced. After that night, I started paying attention to something else. Not the sounds, not the lights. The systems, self-checkout screens, employee login panels, little displays customers never see clearly. Once you've spent enough time working behind a counter, you learn where to look without meaning to. And every once in a while, just often enough to make my stomach twist, I notice something wrong. An employee screen cycling when no one is touching it. A register showing an active session before anyone logs in. A shift schedule posted behind the counter with an overnight slot already filled. Always filled. Never blank. I don't ask about it. I don't lean in close. I don't stare long enough to draw attention to myself. I've learned what happens when you look too closely at systems that don't want to explain themselves. A few weeks ago, I was at a pharmacy just before closing. Not overnight, just late. The cashier apologized for the wait and turned his screen slightly while he fixed something. I didn't mean to look, but I saw it. The employee status panel. 2 names active. He laughed nervously and said, "System glitch," before I could ask. It's been doing that all week. I smiled like it didn't matter, but my chest tightened in that familiar way, slow and heavy. Because I recognized the phrasing. I recognized the dismissal. I recognize the way people talk when something has been happening long enough that explaining it feels pointless. I don't think what happened to me was unique. That's the part I don't say out loud. I think some places, especially ones that never close, learn their routines too well. They learn the rhythms of human presence, the gaps, the habits, the way someone stands behind a counter at 3 a.m. and listens to the building breathe. And sometimes, when someone leaves, without being properly logged out, without a clean ending, the system doesn't register the absence the way it's supposed to, so it fills the gap. I avoid overnight stores now, not because I'm afraid of being alone in them. I'm afraid of not being alone when everything insists I am. Because once in a place that never slept, I learned something I wish I could forget. Shifts don't end just because people leave. And somewhere in some quiet building lit up against an empty road, a system is still doing exactly what it was designed to do. Tracking time, maintaining routine, recording presence. Someone is still clocking in. And every time I pass a 24-hour store and feel that familiar chill, I know it's not because I'm remembering the past. It's because whatever filled that overnight slot never stopped working. It's just waiting for the next person who thinks the night shift is the safest place to be. I didn't plan to go back. That's the lie I told myself afterward anyway. The truth is quieter and worse. I'd thought about it more times than I could count. In the same idle, dangerous way you think about touching something hot just to confirm it will burn you again. I never acted on it until one afternoon years later, when I found myself driving through the outskirts of town with time to kill and a road that felt too familiar. The old sign was gone. That was the first thing I noticed. The cheap neon letters that used to buzz and flicker against the night had been replaced with a clean, modern logo, flat white, evenly lit. No hum, no tremor. The parking lot had been repaved. The cracks sealed the lines, freshly painted. New light poles stood where the old ones had leaned their glow brighter and colder. For a moment, relief washed over me. It's not the same place I thought. You're being dramatic. I parked anyway. The automatic doors slid open smoothly, silently. Inside the store smelled new plastic shelving, fresh paint, something citrusy meant to feel clean. The aisles were wider, the floors shined. The counter had been replaced with a sleek, minimalist setup, all touchscreens and glossy surfaces. No cigarette wall, no buzzing fixtures, No visible camera monitor in the corner. If I hadn't known where to look, I might have believed it had always been like this. A young employee stood behind the counter, tapping on a tablet. He couldn't have been more than 20. He looked up and smiled the polite, distant smile of someone doing a job they didn't think about once they clocked out. "Hey," he said, "let me know if you need anything." His voice was normal, relaxed, unburdened. I nodded and walked the aisles, slowly, my steps measured. The layout was different, but my body still remembered the old one. I caught myself turning where an aisle used to be, slowing near where the back hallway once opened. My chest tightened despite myself. I listened. There was music playing now, soft, generic, designed to fill space so no one ever noticed when it fell quiet. Refrigeration units purred more smoothly than before, their sounds dampened and controlled. The building felt contained, safer. I told myself that was proof enough. Proof that whatever had happened back then belonged to a version of the store that no longer existed. New cameras, new systems, new staff. Fresh starts mattered, didn't they? At the counter, the employee rang up my items quickly. His screen faced away from me, but the reflection in the glass caught my eye, a familiar angle, a familiar glow. I didn't mean to look. I saw it anyway. A small panel in the corner of his screen. Text cycling, quietly, almost hidden among the menus. Active employees, 2. My breath caught. I leaned closer before I could stop myself. "Hey," I said lightly, forcing my voice to stay casual. "Is it usually just you on shift?" He shrugged without looking up. "Yeah, nights are pretty dead." The screen refreshed. 2 entries blinked briefly, then settled. One was his name. The other I straightened abruptly, my heart hammering. "Sorry," I muttered, grabbing my bag. Didn't mean to stare. He laughed. "No worries. System's weird sometimes." That phrase again. I nodded and stepped away from the counter, every instinct screaming at me to leave. As I turned toward the exit, I noticed something else. The cameras. They were new, sleek black domes recessed into the ceiling. No visible wires. No obvious blind spots. I counted them without meaning to. 1 over the counter, 1 over the aisles, 1 near the entrance, and 1 at the back. It faced a door that hadn't been there before. A solid, industrial-looking door with no window. No handle visible from the floor. Just a small keypad mounted beside it, dark and inactive. I stopped walking. That wasn't... I began then, cut myself off. The employee followed my gaze. "Oh," he said, "that's the access room." What kind of access, I asked, hating how tight my voice sounded. He shrugged again. "Storage, I guess. Corporate stuff. We're not supposed to go back there." The words settled uneasily in my chest. I thanked him and pushed through the doors into the daylight, the sun too bright after the artificial glow. Outside, the parking lot felt vast and exposed. My hands shook slightly as I unlocked my car. I sat there for a long moment without starting the engine. Through the glass, I could still see the counter. The young employee had already gone back to his tablet, head down, absorbed. The store looked calm, controlled, efficient, perfect. I checked the time on my phone. 3:17 p.m. The coincidence made my stomach twist, even though it was daylight. Even though it meant nothing. I told myself that as I drove away. But as the store shrank in my rearview mirror, a colder thought took hold. It hadn't needed to scare him. It hadn't needed to test doors, or kill lights, or speak through broken systems. Everything it needed was already in place. Now better cameras, cleaner interfaces, fewer questions. Whatever had learned the night shift all those years ago had adapted, upgraded. And as I merged onto the road, heart still racing, I understood the final truth I'd been avoiding since the beginning. The store didn't remember me. It didn't need to. The shift was still covered, and this time, it looked like it was working exactly as intended. I tried to forget what I'd seen on that screen. That was the plan as I drove away. Put distance between myself and the store, let daylight and traffic and ordinary noise scrub the image from my head. 2 active employees. A phrase I'd heard before. A door no one was supposed to open. I told myself it was coincidence, layered on memory, the kind of trick your mind plays when you revisit a place you're not finished with. It almost worked. Almost. A week later, I found myself back in that part of town again, later than I meant to be. I don't remember deciding to stop. I remember slowing down. I remember signaling. I remember pulling into the lot, like my body had already made the choice without asking me. It was evening this time, not late, not night. The sky was bruised purple, the sun gone, but not forgotten. The store glowed against the dimming road, clean and sharp, its new sign steady and unblinking. I told myself I just wanted closure. Inside the store felt busier than before. 2 customers at the counter. Someone laughing quietly near the coolers. The music played a little louder. The young employee from before wasn't there. A different one stood behind the counter, now older, more distracted. Everything felt grounded in a way that made my nerves itch. I wandered toward the back, pretending to browse my eyes, drifting to places they shouldn't. The new access door was still there unchanged. The camera above it stared down smooth and opaque. Then I saw it. The schedule board. It was mounted on the wall just past the back aisle, half hidden by a display of bottled water. Laminated. Clean. Updated weekly. A corporate template printed in neat blocky fonts, designed to leave no room for interpretation. I hadn't seen it the first time. I stepped closer, my pulse picking up as I scanned the names and times. Morning shifts, afternoon shifts, part-time overlaps. Everything looked normal, boring even. Names I didn't recognize. Hours neatly filled. My eyes dropped to the bottom. Overnight. The slot was there, just like it always had been. Midnight to 8. No gaps. No empty boxes. Just one word written cleanly across the entire row. Covered. I stared at it, my mouth suddenly dry. Not a name. Not initials. Not TBD or on-call or any of the placeholders I'd seen over the years. Covered. My first thought was that it meant something mundane. A shared shift. Remote monitoring. Corporate oversight. Something new. Something efficient. Stores had changed a lot since I worked nights. Everything was automated now. Centralized. Optimized. Still, my hands had started to shake. I leaned closer, scanning the rest of the board for context. Other shifts had names printed in bold. Approved time off was marked clearly. Notes were added in red marker where things overlapped. Overnight had nothing else. Just that one word. I stepped back. When someone passed behind me, my heart racing, as if I'd been caught doing something wrong. The employee behind the counter glanced up briefly, then went back to his screen. No one was paying attention to me. No one cared where I was standing or what I was looking at. I told myself to leave. Instead, I did the thing I'd been avoiding since the beginning. I asked, "Hey," I said, keeping my tone light as I approached the counter. "Quick question." The employee looked up. "Yeah, overnight shifts?" I said, gesturing vaguely toward the back. "Do you guys still staff those, or?" He frowned slightly, like he hadn't thought about it much. "Not really. Not on site." "Then why does the schedule say covered?" He glanced over his shoulder toward the board, squinting. Huh. For a moment, I thought he might actually check. Walk back there. Read it carefully. Think about it the way I was thinking about it. He didn't. Oh, he said, shrugging. That's just how it's listed. Listed, how covered, he repeated, like it answered everything. Means it's handled. Handled by who? He smiled politely, the conversation clearly boring him. System, I guess. Corporate, cameras, alarms, that stuff. That stuff. I nodded like it made sense, thanked him, and stepped away. My legs felt unsteady, like the floor had developed a subtle tilt I couldn't correct for. The words stayed with me as I walked the aisles. Covered, not watched, not monitored, not automated. Covered. It implied presence without identity. Responsibility without a person attached. The same kind of language you use when you don't want to name who's actually doing the work. I remembered the intercom voice. Calm, certain, helpful. I remembered the system logs. 2 active employees. I remembered the canceled badge that never quite disappeared. You can finish your shift. I left without buying anything. Outside, the air felt cooler, heavier. I sat in my car again, staring at the store through the windshield, watching people move inside, like pieces on a board. Everything looked normal, safe, functional. That's what terrified me, because nothing about the schedule suggested uncertainty. No gaps, no warnings, no unresolved slots waiting for someone like me to fill them. Whatever happened overnight here wasn't considered a problem anymore. It had been accounted for. As I drove away, a realization settled into place with a cold, quiet finality. The overnight shift hadn't been eliminated. It hadn't been outsourced. It hadn't been forgotten. It had been solved. And the solution didn't require a name. That was the part no one talked about. That was why the footage was missing, why the files were incomplete, why the manager avoided the subject. Because once a system decides something is covered, it stops asking questions. It stops needing people. Somewhere behind that clean wall and that new access door, something was still doing exactly what it had learned to do, listening to the hum, watching the cameras, keeping time through the quietest hours. The store didn't need an overnight worker anymore, not the way it used to. And standing there, in my car engine, running hands tight on the wheel, I finally understood the shape of the dread that had been following me for years. I wasn't afraid of what happened back then. I was afraid of how efficiently it had been integrated, because when I'd worked nights, the schedule had always needed a name. Now it didn't. Now it just needed the assurance that no matter what, no matter who came or went, the darkest hours would always be handled, covered. And once something earns that kind of trust, it doesn't matter if anyone remembers how it started. The shift is still covered, and nothing is ever really clocked out. I didn't go back after that. Not right away. Not dramatically. I just adjusted my routes, took different roads, found excuses to avoid that side of town, told myself I didn't need closure anymore, that I'd already seen enough to know how the story ended. Life helped with that lie. Work got busy. Days blurred together. Weeks passed. The memory of the schedule board dulled at the edges, softened by repetition and distance. I stopped checking the time so obsessively. I stopped flinching at every beep, every click, every hum that sounded a little too familiar. Mostly. Then one evening, months later, I realized I was low on gas again. I noticed it too late. The warning light came on, just as traffic thinned, and the buildings spaced out the road, stretching empty ahead of me. I slowed down, scanning for familiar signs, my chest tightening when I saw the glow up ahead. A 24-hour station. Not that one. Different brand. Different town. Smaller. Older. The kind that sits alone at the edge of a highway, lit up like a raft in dark water. I almost kept driving, but the needle was already flirting with empty, and the next exit was too far. I pulled in my movements, automatic detached. I didn't even turn the radio down. I didn't want the silence. The lot was empty. The doors slid open when I approached, and I was hit with the same cool recycled air I'd spent so many nights breathing. The smell was different. Less coffee, more cleaning solution. But the undercurrent was the same. Fluorescent lights, quiet aisles, a space designed to function without witnesses. There was no one at the counter. "Hello." I called, my voice echoing slightly. No answer. I stood there for a second, debating whether to leave and risk it, when I noticed the sign taped to the register. "Back in a moment." I felt my shoulders relax despite myself. Human absence had an explanation. That mattered. I grabbed what I needed quickly, not letting my eyes linger anywhere for too long. I avoided looking for cameras, avoided listening too closely. I told myself I was done letting my past dictate my behavior. At the counter, the register screen was already on, a transaction open, waiting. I hesitated, then I heard it. Beep. The intercom chirp was soft, almost polite. Not loud enough to startle anyone else, just enough for someone who knew the sound to recognize it instantly. My body went cold. I didn't turn around. I didn't look up at the speakers. I stayed exactly where I was, hands resting on the counter, my reflection staring back at me from the glossy surface. For a moment, nothing else happened. I thought maybe I'd imagined it. That stress and memory had finally won. Then the voice came through. "You can finish up." It was the same tone. Calm. Neutral. Familiar in a way that had nothing to do with comfort. My heart began to pound slow and heavy, each beat echoing in my ears. I swallowed my throat dry. "I don't work here," I said quietly, not sure who I was talking to. The store, the memory, myself. There was a pause. I know the voice replied. The cashier still hadn't returned. The aisles were empty. The lights buzzed softly overhead. Everything else behaved exactly the way it was supposed to. I forced myself to breathe. In through my nose, out through my mouth. "Then don't talk to me," I said. "I'm just a customer." Another pause. The register drawer slid open with a soft pop. I flinched, my fingers digging into the counter. The sound carried too well in the quiet space, bouncing off tile and glass. The screen refreshed on its own numbers, flickering briefly before settling. A total appeared. I hadn't scanned anything. "I don't want this," I said louder now. My voice shook despite my effort to steady it. "I'm leaving." I grabbed my items and turned toward the door. Behind me, the intercom crackled gently. "You forgot something?" I stopped. Every instinct screamed at me not to turn around, but I didn't have to. I already knew what it meant. I could feel it, the same pressure I'd felt years ago, the sense of being accounted for, logged, tracked. What I asked, my voice, barely above a whisper. The reply came immediately, as if it had been waiting for permission. "You never clocked out." The words hit me with a cold finality that stole the air from my lungs. I laughed, a short, broken sound that didn't feel like it belonged to me. "That's not funny," I said automatically, the old line rising up without effort. "I don't work nights anymore." "I know," the voice said again, patiently. "Your shift ended." My hands trembled. I pushed through the doors and stepped out into the night air, gasping like I'd been underwater. The parking lot was still empty. My car sat exactly where I'd left it. The world outside looked unchanged, ordinary, indifferent. I didn't look back. I drove home on autopilot, my thoughts scattered, refusing to settle into anything coherent. I told myself I'd imagined it. That stress and memory and coincidence had finally blurred together into something convincing enough to scare me. I almost believed that, until I checked my phone. There was a notification waiting. No vibration, no sound, just a small banner on the screen easily missed. System alert. I frowned, my stomach tightening as I tapped it open. The message was brief, generic, unremarkable to anyone else. Shift status updated, overnight covered. No store name, no location, no explanation, just confirmation. I stared at the screen for a long time, my reflection faintly visible in the dark glass. My hands were steady now, my breathing slow. The panic had burned itself out, leaving behind something colder and heavier. Understanding. I didn't delete the notification. I didn't respond to it. I set my phone face down and sat there in the quiet of my apartment, listening to the building settle around me. Somewhere nearby, a refrigerator clicked on. In the distance, a door closed. Ordinary sounds. Harmless sounds. Sounds that had once meant nothing. I don't tell this story because I want answers. I don't tell it because I think someone can fix it. I tell it because if you work nights, if you stand alone in a place that never closes and start to feel safe, because nothing ever happens, you should know this. Some systems don't stop when people leave. They don't need permission. They don't need witnesses. They just need enough time to learn the routine. I left that store years ago, but somewhere in some building that stays lit while the rest of the world sleeps, the overnight shift is still running. The cameras are still watching. The intercom is still ready. The schedule is still filled, and whoever or whatever learned how to cover that shift doesn't need me anymore. It already knows how to finish the night. You never clocked out. And the shift is still covered. What makes this story unsettling isn't the idea of a monster, a ghost, or something supernatural hiding in the dark. What lingers long after the last line is something quieter and much closer to our real lives. This story is about routine. At first, the night shift feels safe, predictable, controlled. The same sounds repeat every night. The same lights stay on. The same systems reassure the narrator that everything is being watched, logged, accounted for. In many ways, it reflects how adults often cope with uncertainty by trusting structure. We trust schedules, technology procedures, and rules to protect us from chaos. But slowly, the story asks a disturbing question. What happens when routine continues without the person? The fear here doesn't come from sudden violence. It comes from realization. The realization that systems don't understand people the way people understand each other. A system doesn't notice fear. It doesn't question silence. If something stops responding, it doesn't grieve. It simply compensates. It fills gaps. It marks things as covered. From a more positive and grounded perspective, this story can be read as a reminder of how easy it is to disappear quietly in modern life. Not in a dramatic way, but in the way exhaustion, isolation, and routine can slowly erase our presence if no one is paying attention. The missing overnight worker isn't frightening because of what happened to him, but because of how little resistance the world offered when he was gone. There's also something deeply human in the narrator's experience. Even after leaving, the sounds remain. The intercom beep, the fridge clicking on, the footsteps. That isn't just horror, it's memory. It's how our bodies remember environments long after we think we've moved on. Anyone whose work nights, lived alone, or spent long hours in quiet spaces knows this feeling. Certain sounds become part of us. Yet the story isn't hopeless. If anything, it quietly encourages awareness. It reminds us that people need to be seen, not just logged. That presence matters. That checking in on each other, really checking, can make the difference between someone being on shift and someone being noticed. And perhaps most importantly, it invites us to reflect on our own lives. How often do we rely on systems to do the noticing for us? How often do we assume everything is fine because nothing has triggered an alert? The horror in this story isn't that the night shift continues. It's that no one asked who was still working it.